Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video, and in this video we're back with another of my 5-year anniversary videos, where this is one of the bigger topics on the board, where 5 years later I'll finally be re-ranking every winner of Survivor US, which obviously last time I did it, again 5 years ago, it was in between Survivor Edge of Extinction and Survivor IOI, that we had 38 winners to rank at that point. However, now we're at the point where we have 46 winners, again 8 more winners have been crowned since that time, while also, I do feel like my overall view on certain winners have changed since then. To where while my overall criteria is relatively similar since last time, in the fact that I am ranking these people based on the games they played on their specific winning seasons, not how they are as players in the grand scheme of things, but the way I do rank winners, again, by the level of dominance that they displayed through the season, not just by how much control they had in the season, but also their positioning through the season, how optimally I feel like they play throughout the season, obviously their winning chances by the end, to where here we will be going through all 46 winning games. Now, with that, I should also mention the fact that the organization of this list is a little bit different since last time as well. Last time, I just kind of broke people down between top, bottom, middle tier, and then had these kind of loose breakdowns in between those tiers. This time, I have a bit more solidified of groupings here, where I essentially broke this ranking down into 9 separate sub-tiers. And obviously, let's start off the ranking at number 46, where, again, this is obviously the bottom tier of the list. These are players that I don't feel like had much wherewithal in the game, didn't really know what was going on in the game, and mostly won due to things that they didn't really actively do, which I know some people will qualm with that description of this first player we're going to be talking about, though obviously this one has a lot of extenuating circumstances. And at number 46, the worst winner of Survivor US is still Chris Underwood. What a shocker. And for me, again, Chris Underwood is the definitive bottom pick. I mean, obviously he was someone that got voted out of the game and had to come back into game, which already is a massive knock for me. Again, it's completely going against the initial premise of the show and the fact that you are supposed to avoid elimination. And on most given seasons, there's not an opportunity to return to the game. So just the fact that Chris was given that opportunity is already a massive luck-based circumstance that no other winner has had to take that opportunity up to this point. But even beyond that, even Chris's game around that is not that great. And a lot of people really praise him. And to be fair, I think I did at the time too, of his end game after he comes back from the edge, being him playing as well as he possibly could have, where I don't even know if that's really the case. I mean, I do think the final 6 round is pretty good. Again, him being able to convince Lauren to play the idol on him. Again, that is very impressive play. However, I do think the final 5 round is not good. It's a situation where he's a dead man walking if he doesn't have an idol that was essentially handed to him. Now, I do think he does good work in keeping Rick Devens in line, giving him half idol back, but again, I don't feel like that's a round where he's playing the best he possibly could, where if he was playing the best he possibly could, he wouldn't have been the person with the majority of the votes in that round. Though obviously him giving up immunity to take on Rick Devens and Fire, again, great move there. Obviously he needed Rick Devens out of the game. Obviously that's something that boosts his legacy, though also, to be fair, that's something that the people on the edge told him to do. And I think that's really kind of the general issue also, is the fact that the issue with Chris's game goes even beyond just the concept of him having been voted out and came back into the game, which again, I still think is a massive issue there, especially considering, again, he didn't play his first run in the game particularly well, where while he was in the middle initially, he was still the biggest physical presence on that tribe, the person that was even keeping them in challenges, and they still vote him out. Though, to be fair, I do think he gets kind of unlucky in Rick Devens and David's state of mind, and them thinking that they needed to take him out to keep peace with the other side in the case of a swap, only for them to get unlucky in how the swap plays out. But anyway, I think Chris Underwood, again, his initial run is not particularly good. But again, I think the bigger issue in all this for me is how he wins the game. Again, the entire premise of the show is that you're supposed to either be directly or indirectly responsible for the people on the jury going home, and then those people are supposed to turn around and proceed to vote for you to win. The issue is that Chris was not responsible for anyone on the jury that voted for him to win outside of Reem and Victoria. Everyone else was someone that was on the edge with him in a situation where they weren't even properly playing the game. So obviously that allows Chris to garner more jury respect from them, especially now as they see themselves in his shoes. And again, I think for Chris's game here being at the bottom, it really goes even just beyond the concept of him being voted out and came back to the game. It's also the fact that, again, I don't think his end game is as good as people say. I think also his early game is not particularly good, and then also his jury prospects simply come from the edge, a situation that would not happen on the majority of seasons. And really, most of his jury prospects comes from the fact that he comes back from the edge. And really, that's the entire basis of the entire game, when that's a situation that almost never happens in the history of the show. So again, from a pure game perspective and how they play this individual game, I think Chris's game is easily the worst on the board here, easily number 46. Now number 45, we're moving on to another winner that I've constantly talked about. It's one of the worst in the history of the show, and it hasn't really changed. And at number 45, I do have Bob Crowley from Survivor Gabon. And Bob is someone that, I will be honest, I actually did contemplate swapping him with the next person on this list, where, I mean, to give minor credit to Bob, he does get to the final 3 in a situation where he is getting there due to his social strategy. Again, he does not win immunity at final 4 and is able to convince Sugar to allow him to go into fire making. That's good if, again, one, how much did he really convince Sugar? Also, I do think a lot of that has to do with more so Sugar's state of mind at that point. I don't think it really had to do much with what Bob actively did. I think it's more so the fact that Sugar had just lost her father, and Bob reminded her of her dad because he's obviously on the older side of things, to where I think that was probably more of a factor than anything Bob actively did in the game. But again, he at least gets to the end through social strategy means to a degree. I still think the rest of his game, though, is not particularly good. I mean, really the entirety of the game, he is essentially at the very bottom of his alliance. He is someone that is even pretty much kicked out of his own alliance in favor of Randy by the swap portion of the game, to where had his alliance been able to run the show as he was trying to allow them to do, he would have been a dead man walking by the mid-merge phase of the game. And to be fair, he was a dead man walking even in the real life scenario and does win immunities, though also to be fair, I think Marcus would have wiped the floor of him in most other immunity challenges. But again, Bob is someone that I think plays extremely unoptimally for a lot of the game. Again, I think he's in a situation where he is striving for a scenario where he is near guaranteed a loss. He gets really lucked out by the fact that Marcus gets sniped out of the game, something that he really did not want to happen. And then by the time of the merge, we do see him, again, on the bottom. But again, he does do decent-ish work in him, again, having a relationship with Sugar and her convincing him to use his fake idol to gain favor with the others. And again, that can be looked at as a good move, though at the same time, Randy was probably going home anyway. I don't think that really changed much. Instead, actually burned his relationship with Randy to where Randy did not want to vote for him and really struggled with giving him his vote by the end of it. And really beyond that, again, he's essentially winning out in the next few challenges, not being vulnerable until the very end, where again, at that point, he essentially gets saved by Sugar just losing her father. And again, even when he gets to the end against two of the bigger goats of the season, he still barely wins in a 4-3 vote. Susie actually gets 3 votes against him, which is even more egregious, considering how Susie wasn't particularly well liked either. And it's like, again, this is just a bad game. I mean, it's a game where he's on the bottom for most of the game. His win equity is extremely low outside the situation that he gets into, and even that's a situation where he wasn't even striving to get to that situation. Or even coming into the final 4 round, he wanted to go to the end with Maddie, someone that he probably loses against. Really, I just think almost everything is bad about Bob's game, but again, I think there are more instances of him navigating through the game in a more social strategy means than the next person we'll be talking about. But I still feel like that person was a lot more affable to their cast, a lot more liked, had a lot more jury prospects. Which is the main reason why I do have Bob below him here at number 45. At number 44, again, a similar-ish winner. Again, another winner that I don't think had much control in the game, not much agency in the game, and largely got to the end due to challenges. Again, probably more so than Bob, but again, I think this person had better jury prospects, and that person is Fabio from Survivor Nicaragua. And Fabio's game here obviously is one that is very bad. I mean, it's one where, again, he needs to win out at the end. If he doesn't win out, he's a dead man walking for the last 3 votes of that season. And even before that, he didn't really have that much control in the game. And he was someone that was instantly on the bottom on his original tribe, where he sides with Shannon, and Shannon loses the initial battle. He then is still relatively safe after the fact, which, again, partial credit to his social game, partial credit to him being one of the more physical guys. And again, even at the swap, again, he's still in a pretty decent position. Even though, again, he's like Bob, kind of on the bottom of whatever power structure he's a part of. He's not really involved in any true plans, especially for long term, where he's kind of just being dragged around. Even though, again, I think he is at least very likable at that point in the game. Again, unlike Bob, who, again, never seemed to be the most social person in the world, I think Fabio is someone that was very social and very likable, to where even though he got into fights with Nyanka, and Nyanka still liked him from a personal perspective. Though again, once again, when we get to the merge, he's once again on the bottom after the Marty vote, where he sides with Marty. Marty gets blindsided. And really from that point on, he's completely on the bottom. Now, I will say probably one of the biggest detractors against Fabio's game is the fact that the double quit happens. I think that's a situation where if the double quit does not happen, he more than likely doesn't win. as that would obviously be 2 extra rounds that he would need to win immunity for, as again, no matter what, he was already on the bottom by that point in the game. Or while he does have Benry as a shield for him, after Benry's gone, he's essentially a goner. And even in the actual Benry vote, he's like tricked into thinking that Benry is with him. And again, it really gets saved by the fact that Benry is looked as a bigger threat, which again, Fabio didn't really do much to make that the case. And by the end, again, he needs to win out, to where again, he barely wins a jury vote and a 5-4 vote. Mind you, again, coming into Final Tribal, supposedly it was going to be 7-2, and supposedly the Brenda vote was a sympathy vote. And like straight up, I do think Fabio beats most people in the end game. I do think he is a very likely winner against Holly, against Jane, probably against Dan, though that one's a little bit more up in the air. Again, I do think Fabio is a very likely winner if he gets to the end, but again, he needed to get to the end through winning immunities. Also, while also being, again, very fortunate in the fact that the double quit happened. However, again, in comparison to Bob, yeah, I think they are very close. I very much consider swapping them, but again, I do think it is the fact that Fabio had much more win equity at the end, along the fact that I think Fabio is just more liked by his cast, is something that propels him here, where again, they both were on the bottom of whatever alliances they were in. They both needed to win out at major portions of the game. They both didn't really have much control over how the game played out. Yeah, again, I think it is the likability from Fabio, puts him higher, even though, again, I very much consider dropping him because of the double quit situation, but I do think Bob plays a lot more against his best interest for a lot more of his game, where, again, I think Fabio at least tries to play in his best interest, but just kind of fails at that at points, where I feel like Bob just actively doesn't and plays against his best interest. So again, for me, that is enough to put Fabio here at number 44. Now, number 43, we're moving on to a winner that I think I've just gone down on even more over time. I feel like this is a winning game that I actually kind of respected at the time that it happened. Yeah, I feel like in the time since, you kind of recognize how luck-based this person's win was. And at number 43, we do have Michelle Fitzgerald from Survivor Kaoh Rong. Now, again, this is not an assessment of Michelle as a player, even though I still think as a player she's probably a bit overrated. But this is, again, her winning game. And I think for her winning game in Kaoh Rong, it is bad. It's a situation where, again, like the previous people we talked about, she had to win out. She had to win those last few challenges to get to the end. She was very fortunate there. However, I think the big detractor from her, for me, is the fact that the final 5 round essentially had to get canceled. The fact that Joe gets medevac the final 5 round really just saves Michelle, where what would have been the final 5 immunity was used for a reward at the final 4, which was a situation where Aubrey won that challenge. Meaning if Aubrey won immunity at the final 5, more likely Michelle is a goner. To where I think Michelle is someone that gets directly saved by a medevac here, which I think is a major deterrent against her game, especially when she essentially needs to win out anyway. Now, again, I think there is some good work from her. Again, she is able to convince people to vote out Jason instead of her at the final 6. She is actually in the majority in the early merge portion of the game. Again, she is working alongside the Braun and Beauties initially, and is part of the alliance with all the women that takes out Nick and takes out Debbie. But after that, again, she loses favor. She's then on the bottom, not even let in on the Scott Pollard plan, not perceived as big of a threat for his next few rounds, where, again, I just think that part of her game is extremely sloppy. And mixing out of the fact that, again, she never goes to tribal in the pre-merge, and if she does, she was not very well insulated initially, where there is a lot of talk about how the initial alliance on the Beauty Tribe was essentially everybody but her and Nick, to where she very likely would have been a target at the first tribal had they gone to it, though obviously by the end of the pre-swap, she's able to build the all-girls alliance and be in a better position. But even then, at the swap, she is once again on the bottom, potentially going home, though again, that's another situation where, again, it's a swap, so in a way she would have been swap screwed if that were the case. But still, I mean, like, her game is just not that great. I mean, it's a game where she has very little actual control in the game. She's largely on the bottom for a decent chunk of the game, and again, needs to win out, and also gets saved by a medevac at the very end, to where, again, I don't look at Michelle's game particularly fondly here. I do feel like, in comparison to the last few people we talked about, though, again, she at least was in that majority at the time of the merge, and she was involved in the Debbie vote plan, which I think in particular is the one that I'm praising her for here, in that being a situation where literally only 4 people were in on that plan, and she was one of those people. Again, I think that is good. And she obviously wins by a bigger margin at the end than the last few people we talked about, though also, to be fair, that's a situation where Neil was voted out of the jury. But still, I think Michelle is someone that was mostly liked by her cast. I don't think anyone really disliked Michelle by the end. So again, I think all these things together kind of amounts to her being, again, at least better than the likes of Fabio and Bob, but I don't think much better, simply because, again, she gets the win due to a situation that's completely out of her control, and because of that, for me, she's here at number 43. Now, number 42, and now we're moving on to another tier of the list, a tier of players that were in decent spots at a portion of the game, but then completely lost control at a portion of the game, and essentially need to win out from that point forward, to where, well, again, like the previous people we talked about, are people that needed to win out by the end. I think these people were in better positions before they needed to win out. That puts them higher higher on the list here. And we're starting that off at number 42 with one of the more definitive people of this grouping, and that is Ben Driebergen from Survivor HHH. And Ben is a tough player to assess here as, again, like Michelle, I think he gets saved from something that is completely out of his control. With that being, obviously, the forced firemaking twist, that Final Four, something that they did not know about. Something that completely comes out of left field, where he comes into the Final Four tribal thinking he's a dead man walking and gets saved due to this twist being added at the very last second. I think that is something that is a major detractor from Ben's game for me. I actually very much contemplate putting him even lower on the list. However, again, I think in comparison to someone like Michelle, I think Michelle also has that very luck-based circumstance. At the final 5 of the medevac that saves her, I think Fabio has a double quit situation that helps him. And obviously, Chris has the edge. Bob is just Bob, to where, again, really a lot of these lower place winners have these massive luck-based circumstances that save them. So taking that out of it, again, Ben's game is one that is still very rocky. I mean, he is someone that has to essentially idle his way to the end. Again, it's not winning out in the same way that many other people have, but he essentially needs idle after idle after idle and is able to find those idols and utilize those idols to navigate through the game, which again is decent on him, but still it's a situation where despite the fact that he has these idols, which again, idols are much more powerful than immunity necklaces. They actually allow you to have a direct hand in how the votes play out. Ben doesn't really utilize that to the best of his ability. Where obviously he is the sole vote to eliminate at the final 7 round. That's something. At the final 6, again, he doesn't really have much agency there. Where Christy was someone that was already going for Ashley at that point. And at the final 5, again, he's completely out of the loop. Again, he tries to get Devin out twice and fails at getting Devin out in that situation where they're literally keeping Devin in to spite Ben as they think Devin has a better shot at beating Ben in the final challenges. To where I think all that is very bad. However, again, the thing that puts him above the last few winners for me is the game before that. I think before the final 7, I think Ben's game is actually pretty solid. I mean, it's a game where he's in a pretty good spot in his initial tribe. Again, he's right in the middle of everything. He has the alliance with Chrissy, he has the alliance with Alan Ball, and he's really running the show on the original Heroes tribe. He then gets swapped into a pretty unfortunate position where he's facing off against 3 healers, and there is talks about throwing the immunity challenge to vote him out. Yeah, he's obviously able to get through that. And to be fair, if he went out in that situation, I would not really fault him too much for that. As again, I think he just got a very unlucky draw. And when we get to the merge, again, he's again running the show. Again, he is part of the initial dominant alliance. He is really running the game for those first few votes. And again, is part of this double agent plan where he pretends to work with Ryan and Chrissy when he's really with the other side. And all that is very impressive play. The issue comes from the fact that he obviously becomes this massive target at 7. Though even that, I don't know how much to really fault him for. Where obviously, yes, there is still this inherent fault in the fact that there was some level of threat management there. I do think the threat management here really comes from outside the game. I really feel like a lot of the reason why he has this big target on his back really stems from the fact that he is this military man, has a good story, and people just thought he would win if he got to the end. Where that obviously is the main reason why he's targeted here, which to me is not nearly as bad as if he had actively made moves that made him a big target. So again, it becomes a very rocky game because of this. The reason why he is as low as he is here, though, is because of the forced firemaking twist. If it was not for that, he would have been at least a spot higher. Obviously, again, he's still in a situation where he essentially needs to win out by finding idols, and even outside of his idol finding, does not play the end portions of the game particularly well, unlike the next couple we'll be talking about. So again, for me, that's the reason why Ben is here at number 42. Now, number 41. Another winner that had to win out, yet is a winner that I've kind of gone up a little bit since my last ranking, where this person was much lower on the list. They're now a few spots higher. At 41, I do have Jenna Maraska. And Jenna Maraska is a winner that I've never particularly been high on. I remember there was even a point back in the day where I would look at Jenna as the worst winner of the show. And we're at the point now where I don't think that's the case. I mean, Jenna is someone that, while she did need to win out at the very end, I think she was actually pretty decently positioned before that situation happened. Where before the Alex blindside, I think Jenna is in a very prime position to potentially win the game. Where had that Final Four alliance stuck true, she would have been in a Final Four where Alex had already said that he would have been willing to vote out Rob at 4. To where at that point, the most likely endgame situation is a Heidi Jenna Final 2, which I do think it's close between the two. To where again, she was always in this pretty prime position to make it to the end of the game before the flip ends up happening. And while she wasn't this person that was like looked at as running the show like Ben was, she was still again able to be in the majority alliance the entire time up to that point. Again, she was in the initial alliance on the women's alliance. At the swap, she's once again able to build a bond with Rob and Alex. That puts her in the majority there again. And then at the merge again, once again, she's put in the majority alliance. Again, she is in the majority the entire stretch up until the final 7 round. Though again, that is when her game completely crumbles. She essentially needs to win out from that point forward, and does, but there's still some questionable play in all that. Again, she gives up immunity at final 6, which again, I know the justification for it. I still don't think it's a move that really gains her that much. Though, again, to be fair, it does show another round where she's able to survive without winning immunity. But again, she does win immunity final 5 on. To be fair, again, she was not going to be targeted at final 5. It was going to be Heidi anyway, but she was going to be booted final 4, final 3 if she did not win. But even throughout all that, again, she's still able to cultivate a final 2 with Matthew that ends up having Matthew throw the final immunity challenge and honestly ends up winning at the end in a pretty wide margin. So really against most people, I think Jenna would have a good shot at winning, would have guaranteed votes in most situations. Where I think the biggest situation that's a question mark is her versus Rob. Again, that was a situation that was never happening because neither of them were taking each other to the end. So again, I've gone up on Jenna's game over time. However, I still think the fact that, again, she needed to win out at the very end is still a detractor from her. Along with the fact that, again, she never really had much direct control in the game. She never was someone that was this big figurehead in the game, like the way that Ben was, or the person that we'll be talking about next. Yeah, I also don't feel like there was this massive luck-based situation in the way that Ben had with the forced fire making, and that makes me put Jenna a spot higher here at number 41. Now number 40, and now we're moving on to a winner that I think my opinion of this person's game has gone up a decent amount over time, even though it's not really reflected on this winner ranking, where I actually believe they're potentially lower on this ranking than they were in the last one, at least in terms of in relation to the first 38 winners. But still a winner that, while they needed to win out, still had a lot of control in the game. That person is Mike Holloway from Worlds Apart. And again, Mike Holloway is someone that, yes, he does need to win out. Again, from the final 9 on, he wins every challenge from that point forward outside of one, and even in that one challenge, he ends up having an immunity idol. That is very, very bad in terms of his navigation through the game. Again, in terms of just raw navigation through the game and positioning, that is terrible. That he essentially needed to win all of those challenges and needed that idol. And from a pure positioning standpoint, I think there's a serious debate for him being the worst winner in the history of the show. However, I think something that props him up here is, again, I think Mike had a lot of control over how the game played out. I mean, really, up until the final 9, where his alliance flips on him, Mike is essentially in a dominant position that entire time. Again, he is in a very strong position as the original tribe, has an alliance with Kelly, and through it, they also have relationships with Rodney and Dan that ends up running the original blue collar tribe. Again, gets swapped into a situation where, again, he's once again in a power position, is able to get Sierra to flip the vote onto Joaquin, which, to be fair, does burn his relationship with Rodney, which might be a detractor from him, but still, I think overall, still displayed a lot of agency there. Obviously loses his number 1 ally through an idol play at the merge, which you can fault him for, and why didn't they split the vote? Though also they didn't know they had Will's loyalty, which was the main reason why. But beyond that, again, is still in the majority alliance as they vote out Haley and Joe. Only they didn't have his alliance turn to him at 9. Or again, it's kind of a situation like Ben. Again, he's at that point just naturally looked at as a big target on the board, being this massive guy that's been in a strong position. Though also through that, I think there's probably more fault on Mike for his threat management than Ben, where I think there's less out of the game situations that made him a target there. And I think you'd also say that the Joaquin vote was part of what put the target on him as well. But even then, I mean, really, even Dan Foley is someone that was working really closely with Mike, also turns him at that point, which I think is not great for him. Again, he's in a spot where he needs to win out. I think something I very much respect from Mike is that despite the fact that he is needing to win out, he still actually has a lot of agency throughout that portion of the game. While he doesn't initially, again, Jen goes home and Shireen goes home, which obviously he did not want to happen. He's still able to keep his idol, all that. And through that, at the final 7, he's able to have a lot of agency there. He's able to pull in Sierra and Carolyn into voting out Tyler. Doing so, being able to utilize his idol effectively and getting a target out of the game, a situation where, again, they were planning on splitting the vote on him. Even beyond that, again, he has agency at the Dan Foley vote, where he once again gets Carolyn to go on board with taking out Dan, or she uses her idol to take Dan out in that situation. And at the final 5, he has direct control. Again, that's a situation where, after winning immunity, essentially is a 2v2 with him right in the middle, and he is the deciding factor in that vote. Where he takes out Sierra, which is an optimal move, and him taking out someone that could potentially be him in final immunity, to where obviously he wins final immunity and gets to the end in a situation where he causes fire at 4, which again, that's a more marginal move, but obviously through Carolyn not performing particularly well, does kind of lower her threat level at the end, where again, I think Mike plays a pretty strong game in the back portion of the game, despite the fact that he actually needs to win out throughout that portion of the game. I think really from the final 7 on, I think he has a lot of control in how the game is playing out, despite the fact that he is the number 1 target on the board, which is such a fascinating game to see play out, where again, I think you very much see in a lot of situations where these people need to win out, that they don't have much control in those portions of the game where they need to win out. They are essentially on the bottom with no real say in what is happening, yet Mike is able to actually have a lot of control in those endgame portions. to where mixing that, the fact that he had that control early on in the game as well, again, I think it is not an overly bad game. However, the reason why he is this low is obviously because he did need to win out. Again, his positioning in the game was simply terrible. If he did not win or didn't have an idol through any of those rounds from the final 9 on, he is a dead man walking. He is out of the game. I think the only chance of potentially saving himself is his relationship with Carolyn. Yet even then, I don't think that would have really stuck at the end. Where again, it's a very conflicting game here. I think it's one where, again, there's a lot of control, but there's also some terrible positioning. I do think the level of control he had is much more than any of the players we talked about so far. Despite his bad positioning, I feel like it's still enough to put him here at number 40. Now number 39, and now we're starting off the final sub-tier of my bottom tier, this being a tier of players that were under the radar winners that didn't have much control over how the game played out, but also were relatively safe for a lot of the game. Yet despite all this, I don't think we're players that were playing particularly actively. I think we're people that were being either dragged through the game or kind of just allowed other people to make the decisions for them. To which the players that I do think had a lot more gusto in how they played the game are people that are on the sub-tier above this one. Well, we're starting off this sub-tier at number 39 with the first of the wins from a 2-time winner. And here we do have Sandra Diaz-Twine's game from Survivor Heroes vs. Villains. And this is actually a little bit of a rise in her game from my last list. So where, well, I'm sure there's still a lot of people that are very upset at how Sandra is this low. I still think her Heroes vs. Villains game is not particularly good. I think it's a situation where, again, she's winning kind of by accident, where she tries so hard for a lot of the game to take out Russell and fails at that, yet despite her failing, she's able to be dragged to the end by Russell, where she ends up beating him at the end. Where, again, there is some good play in that, but it still feels like she's playing against her best interest for a lot of the game. And that's the main reason why I had her so low on my previous list, so where, again, she's a little bit higher now, simply because I do think her navigation through the game is actually still pretty decent. So despite the fact that she is trying to blindside Russell for a lot of the game and is actively putting these plans together to try to take him out and failing at it, she still somehow never actually looked at as a threat from Russell beyond that, despite the fact she is a massive jury threat. Essentially beats any of the villains at the end. Yeah, that was something that just Russell just seemed to completely not recognize, which I do think is something to at least credit her with. Now, I think beyond that, I think her game is very rocky. I mean, I think early on, again, she is an initial majority alliance on the Villains tribe. I think that is still some decent play there. Again, the fact that she is building a strong bond with Courtney and Boston Rob and Tyson that are the core, and then they had Jerry and Coach by their side, though to be fair, again, she did not have a good relationship with Coach, but still able to be in the majority early on until obviously the Tyson vote happens, where again, that's not really doing anything that she did wrong. And even beyond that, again, she's able to pull over the Coach move, which is something that a lot of people give her a lot of credit for. I give her obviously some credit, but I think it's a move that is very contextual. I think it's one that really works due to things that she didn't really even know, where the reason why this move goes through is because Russell realized that this was a opportunity to take out Coach, and through that really play into the story that's the women controlling the game and that he could go into the merge and pretend like he was on the bottom, which again is a very savvy play from Russell, and one that I think makes this move effective in a situation where, despite all of Sandra's campaigning, I don't know how effective it would have actually been if it was not for Russell being on board with this plan, which again was not really due to the reasons why Sandra campaigned for the move. And beyond that, again, I think she's saved by in the following round where Courtney goes home due to things completely out of her control. I mean, that's simply due to pre-gaming, where obviously everyone knew that Courtney was going to flip and work with JT and Amanda, who she had outside of the game relationships with, to where, again, she comes into the merge where, despite her telling the truth to the heroes, they simply don't believe her. And again, she tries to also flip the vote onto Russell at the final 9 round as well. Where again, I think all that is very bad. The fact that she is trying to make these moves and isn't able to get them through. Yeah, I feel like beyond that, I actually do give her a little bit more credit nowadays. Again, while I do think her being left out of the Danielle vote is not particularly good, really the rest of her game is, again, solid in the sense that, again, she is still in the majority the rest of the game. She is voting alongside the majority. She is not in any particular danger and is still, again, being looked at someone that should be dragged through the game, despite the fact that, again, she beats almost everybody. So the only villain that actually wants her out is Parvati, and Parvati fails at getting her out. So again, I think that is something to credit her for. To where, while again, I still very much demerit her for how much she failed at most of the things she tried to do, I think when she gets to the end game and has this awareness that I can now just go to the end of Russell and beat him, I think the fact that she had that awareness there and was able to shift her plans, again, be adaptable in that situation, while also, again, being in the majority for a decent chunk of the game, despite the fact that it's not necessarily going her way. Again, I think that's enough to credit Sandra for at this point, to where she is slightly higher than where she was last time, being here at number 39. Now, number 38, we're moving on to a player that has just been very rocky in my mind of my opinions of this player, where they've just gone completely up and down. Where I believe I was higher on them at the time of my last list, though since then I've rewatched their season, kind of went up a little bit, only then to remember all the negatives about her games as well that we went back down. But at number 38 here, we're going to go with Vecepia. And Vecepia is a player that is commonly talked about as being an extremely underrated player, having played a really good game that doesn't get appreciated. And to that, I just don't really agree. Now, I do think there is some praise to give to Vecepia, especially in her adaptability, the fact that she was a very palatable player in the game and someone that was able to avoid being targeted over the likes of like Rob and Sean. But to be fair, I think she was always going to have that. But again, she's someone that I think early on, again, is in a decent spot on the original Maharamu tribe, is in the Majority Alliance, where they take out Hunter's Alliance along the way. And Ozzy gets swapped into a very unfortunate position. Yeah, again, in that position, she's the least targeted of the people swapped over to Row 2, to where she comes into the merge, not in a good spot because the Maharamus are severely diminished, but is still safe for the short term. Eventually we get the big move at the final 9, the flip against John Carroll, the fall of the Row 2-4, this really game-changing move for Survivor history. And based on everything I've seen, like, I feel like Vecepia is the least integral to that actually happening. It doesn't feel like she was that important to that vote going through, where at least on their show, we see more of Kathy and Sean putting in the legwork to make this vote go through, and obviously Nalia being the final decision maker, to where Vecepia is just kind of out of the picture throughout at least the televised version. Now, again, I'm sure she was attempting to pull them over along the way, but still, we don't really see much of that on the show. And after that vote goes through, again, she's obviously safe for next few rounds. She is someone that is not in danger until the final 5, and even at the final 5, and obviously Sean is targeted over her, yeah, but really by her and Sean not making a move throughout the next few rounds, she's really putting herself in the position where she essentially needs to win out, where again, she loses Sean at 5 because she's not able to convince Kathy to go her way, and she then wins immunity at final 4 in a situation where she would have been voted out had that not been the case. And again, even at final 4, while I think you can praise her for voting with Kathy and going to Rocks, it's still a situation where she had to be prompted by Kathy to do so, where Kathy was the person to approach her and make the alliance. And again, that's the biggest issue with Vecepia for me. I feel like we very rarely ever see Vecepia actively do anything in the game. It's really a lot of people approaching her, a lot of people doing things seemingly for her that really has Vecepia not seeming to have much agency in the game. So the only time that we see her actively do something on her own is at the final 3, and her throwing the final 3 immunity to take out Kathy, which again is a good move on paper, but the way she does it is terrible. She's completely burning Kathy's jury vote through doing so. She's also not willing to own up to her move the entire time, and just further makes Kathy even more bitter along the way. And then at the end, she barely wins. She wins in a 4-3 against Nalia in a situation where John Carroll has said that the Row 2s were willing to vote for Nalia. She just owned up to her game, which she didn't, which again kind of feels like it's a situation where Vecepia is winning simply because of Nalia's terrible final tribal performance. So supposedly from behind the scenes stuff, we've heard that supposedly both of them really botched Final Tribal to the point where they had to refilm it. To where again, Vecepia's game to me is just simply not that good. I mean, even though there is some decent adaptability at points, she simply has no real agency for a lot of the game, to where while she is in a good position on the original Maharamu tribe, she simply isn't able to do much beyond that. Well, obviously a lot of that comes from the fact that she was just simply on the bottom, do things outside of her control. I feel like even at points where she was in the majority, particularly again, that stretch from the final 6 to final 8, she doesn't really do anything to really better her position. Really just setting herself up for a very rocky endgame, to where and I just feel like Vecepia is just simply not active of a player enough on this season. We also didn't have the greatest winning prospects to be much higher here than number 38. Now number 37, we're moving on to, well, again, I do look at very similarly to Vecepia. However, for me, a major reason why this person is higher is because of win equity. While their game outside that is just as up and down as Vecepia's was, I do feel like this person had more win equity at the end, and that person is someone we've already talked about on the list. It's Sandra Diaz-Twine, but her game from Pearl Islands. And again, Sandra's game on Pearl Islands is, to me, better than Heroes vs. Villains. Again, in Heroes vs. Villains, I feel like she, again, is playing against her best interest for a lot of the game and kind of just stumbles into this winning position in the end, where she becomes aware her positioning like at the tail end of that game. However, I do feel like in Pearl Islands, I think her game is a bit more intentional, though even then, not by that much. Where again, obviously, Sandra does get to the end against Lil, handily beats Lil. However, despite that, Sandra also thought of Lil as the biggest threat on the board and did not want to go to the end of Lil. So while again, I think it gets fair play, it's a very close vote, and it's likely that she narrowly squeezes out the win. Again, I think that is a pretty big misread for her to have at the very end. Even beyond that, I do feel like she just has a very turbulent game at the end game, to where while she is in the initial majority alliance coming to the merge, she also is in a position where after the Rupert vote, she's just in and out of the majority constantly. And I think she makes a big mistake at the Tawana vote, where she really just enables Burton and fair play in the game, even though, again, she's able to eventually take out Burton at the final 5. Now, how much credit she deserves for that, I think is questionable. I used to give her a lot of credit for it. However, I do think having a rewatch Pearl Islands, I think it's very clear that it's more so Lil's move, and Lil was more of the active person that enacts that move over Sandra, but still, Sandra definitely is involved in that. However, again, outside that, again, I think there's just a lot of suboptimal play for Sandra. Again, during the Rupert vote, she votes for fair play in a situation where she thought it was going to be a tie coming into it, so why are you putting your vote on fair play? Beyond that, again, her constant arguments with people, also not particularly good, to where while, again, she'd still get some of the jury votes, the people she argues with, it's not play that should be effective. Also, she more than likely is the first boot from the Drake tribe had they gone to the first tribal, where really most people back this up in post-game press. Even Rupert, one of her bigger supporters, backs this up that she would have been the first boot, to where, again, feel very positive that she would have been the first boot from the Drake tribe had they gone to tribal, to where that's also not good. Now, again, she's able to recover from that and build this really strong bond with Krista and Rupert that really runs the pre-merge tribe. But again, I really just feel like her game has a lot of ups and downs. It's a game where, again, there are some decent plays from her. Again, the fact that she's able to recover early on, the fact that she's able to pull together the Burton vote, the fact that she is able to have Lil take her to the end, despite the fact that she berates Lil throughout a lot of the game, and the fact that, again, she has a lot of win equity. I think she beats most people, where obviously she beats Lil. I think it's probable she beats fair play in a 4-3 vote. She probably beats Burton and Krista. So really, outside of Dara, I feel like she probably beats everybody in the in-game stretch, to where, again, I do think there is good play from Sandra on this season at points. I just feel like the overall nature of it is very sporadic, and because that's tough to put her too much higher, though, again, I think in comparison to Vecepia in particular, I think both of their games are extremely turbulent, to where both have pretty solid pre-merges, though, again, more rocky post-merges, to where, again, it is the win equity that I think Sandra had, to where, again, I think Sandra beats a lot of people in the end game, while Vecepia, I think, struggles to beat most people in the end game. Again, barely winning against Nalia, probably beats Sean, but probably loses to everybody else, to where, again, I think that is the minor difference here for me that leaves her here number 37. Now number 36, and here we do have another pretty controversial pick here. I mean, this is a person that is pretty well revered in the Survivor community, someone that is looked at pretty positively, especially being looked at as one of the better, more recent winners. However, I think when looking at their winning game, I just disagree, and that person is Maryanne Oketch from Survivor 42. And Maryanne is a very tough player to assess here, in the fact that in comparison to the next few players we'll be talking about, Maryanne has the bigger individual move than a lot of those players. Again, she makes the move against Omer using her extra vote to snipe him out of the game. Again, that is a pretty impressive play for her to pull off a better individual move than what many of the people that we'll be immediately talking about have on their resumes. Yet, I feel like the rest of her game is a lot more sloppy. And even beyond that, even the move to take out Omer, well, again, it is a good move. It's not really an original idea. It's not like this is a plan that is entirely on Maryanne. Again, this is something that Mike and Jonathan had originally wanted to do before Maryanne was even involved, and simply backed out of the plan because they knew Lindsay had the amulet that she had to play during that round, where, again, Lindsay would have been an idiot to not play the idol during that round, and what do you know, she doesn't. So again, that's something that obviously is very luck dependent on Maryanne. I think the fact that her move actually goes through is something that simply should not have worked. I mean, it's something that she does no real work in making Lindsay not play her idol. Again, she has no effect on that. So again, even then, it's like, yeah, it's a good move, but it's one that, it's not like she was the only person that was willing to make a move like that. But really, again, when looking at the rest of her game, I mean, it's simply just not that great. Again, as I said, she is obviously an under radar winner. I think she spends a lot of the game under the radar, especially in the early post-merge, so where she simply is not that involved in decision making. She's simply just being told what to do, going along with the majority, working alongside Itaku 4 in secret, but even then, not even being included in a lot of the alliances that they are included in, where we see Jonathan, Lindsay, and Omer being part of this big majority group that forms at the merge that really runs a lot of the early merge phase, which again, Marianne's left out of. But really, that's not even the most damning aspect of Marianne's game for me. I think the main reason why Marianne is as low as she is because her early game is pretty bad. Again, she is on the bottom of Taku for a decent chunk of the pre-merge. I mean, she's in a situation where, again, it's either her or Mariah going home in episode 2, where, again, she barely squeaks that out. She is a dead man walking for episodes 3 and 4, to where, had they gone to Tribal in either of those episodes, she is essentially auto out of the game with no chance to save herself. And there was no world where they were voting out Jonathan, Lindsay, or Omer in that situation, and she wouldn't even had a vote considering Beware Advantage wasn't activated. So again, I think that's a position that's really, really bad. And again, the only reason she would have survived in episode 5 is because at that point she would have had the idol, to where, again, she is essentially a dead man walking for a good chunk of the early game, to where, again, that is pretty bad. Now, I will say part of that is due to Jackson getting medevac. That led to her having less buffers in the game, but still, I still think the fact that she was such a goner for multiple rounds in the game is, again, not great, to where, because that, again, it made it a bit tough for me to rank her. Again, I do think taking out the Omer move and how well she pitched herself at Final Tribal, I think she would actually be debatably lower than the likes of Sandra or Vecepia, to where she really spends a lot of the game at the bottom of the game. Yeah, again, I think it is the active play that she has at the very end. The fact that she is able to pull over this Omer move, the fact that she is pretty well positioned in the end game despite that, so despite her having this big move on her resume now, and she doesn't really expedite the target on her back. Again, Lindsay is still the number 1 target at the Final 5 round, which again, still some question marks in her wanting to keep Lindsay initially, but still does end up voting her out. Again, I think she has some delusions about her Final 4 round, where again, in her pitch at Final Tribal, she claims that everyone was going to take her to the end, which isn't even true, but still is relatively safe. Obviously, it gets saved by Romeo. Again, Mike would have been up in the air. I think there is at least some decent play there. But again, she also has a very good Final Tribal performance. Again, one of the better ones of the people we've talked about so far. I think an issue stems from the fact that she kind of needed that Final Tribal performance. And again, that's another reason why she's as low as she is because she barely wins the game. Or while she does end up winning in a 7-1 vote, coming into Final Tribal, the votes were all over the place. Again, it seemed like it was actually going to be a tie coming into Final Tribal. For a while, technically, again, if it was a tie, Romeo would have voted for her and she would have won anyway. Again, that is a very precarious position to be in, to where the vote is that close. And again, she does a very good job at pitching for herself at Final Tribal. Again, not to taking away from that, but I still feel like, again, considering her navigation through the game, the fact that she had this big Omer move on her resume, and that didn't seem to really gain her that much respect from the jury, I think that is definitely a question mark. And I think she plays a solid under radar game. Again, despite the fact that, again, she was in a lot of danger early on, she simply was not that involved in a lot of the decision making in the early merge phase of the game. I think the end game stretch for her is mostly solid, despite some, again, questionable play out points. So again, the reason she's even this high is because I do think she is an active player. Again, to the point where I did consider putting her in the active under radar tier. That's actually where I intended on putting her when I started this video. Though again, the more I think about it, the more, again, she is just on the bottom for a lot of the game with very little control over how the game is playing out, to where while she has that one instance that she is just sole decision maker and what is going on, I just feel like it's still a spot where that is not enough to qualify you as a more active player when she played a more passive game throughout the rest of it. Again, not saying it's not an effective strategy for her to utilize, where obviously it is. However, I do think, again, in comparison to the other winners, I'm more impressed by the winners that do more actively for more of the game. And again, in direct comparison to the people we'll be talking about following this, they were just better positioned in the game than Marianne was. To where while Marianne might have a better individual move than these next few players, she is still someone that is in a very precarious spot for a lot more of the game. So again, because of that rockiness, I did have to leave Marianne here at number 36. Now, number 35, and this might be a controversial placement because this is actually a massive change from my previous list, to which I think the fact that this person is in this tier might be, again, a bit controversial, to where, again, someone that is typically much higher on most people's lists was much higher on my previous list. Yeah, I feel like as time goes on, I just become lower and lower on this person's game, with me really feeling like this person played pretty suboptimally for a lot of the end game stretch, and really gets lucked out by a lot of factors in the end game, while also not really having that much control over how a lot of the game played out, especially in the post-merge, and that player is Denise Stapley from Survivor Philippines. And again, my opinion of Denise's game just continues to go down as time goes on. I mean, again, I am at this point now where I do think Denise is a, again, passive under the radar winner, which again would definitely get some criticism from people. Again, a lot of people like to praise Denise, that, oh, she's the person that went to every single tribal, she survived every tribal, and that has to be a great player, which is is like, I mean, yeah, obviously it's good. It's definitely not a negative, but it's also not a massive pro for me. Again, like the fact that she survives every single tribal is simply just meaning that her tribe sucks so bad that she had to go to every tribal. To where in reality, most winners, if they went to every tribal, probably do also survive every tribal. To where the fact that just Denise is the only person to actually do this just means, again, that her tribe sucks so bad that she actively had to go to every tribal. But again, obviously the fact that she does go to tribal means that she has to play more game. And through that, again, I think her early game is actually very strong. Again, her on the original Matt Singh tribe is the best part of her game. Again, she is this power duo with Malcolm that really runs the entire show. However, I don't know how much to really credit for her there, especially up until episode 4, where again, when you have a tribe that has like 2 really massive physical liabilities, and she's also one of the most physical people on it, and a tribe that continues to lose. Again, it's not shocking that Denise would be in a decent position there. But obviously, yes, builds a very strong bond with Malcolm, and I think the most impressive part of all her play, really maybe across the entire season, is how she plays the Russell Swan round. Again, the fact that she's able to get Russell Swan to vote for Malcolm, I think is very impressive play there. And obviously, she ends up being dissolved into Calabao, where again, I think she plays pretty well in that portion of the game. Again, not really being able to actively be a decision maker in anything, but again, attaches herself to the guys, makes it to the merge unscathed despite going to 2 tribals. Again, that is pretty good as well. For me, it is around the time the merge. I feel like her game just kind of unravels in the sense that I don't think she really does much from the post-merge on. I think from that point on, she really just relies a lot of her game into Malcolm, and Malcolm is the person that we see doing a lot more of the legwork. He is the person that cultivates this relationship with Skupin and Lisa that allows them to be in this final 7 alliance that runs the show. Malcolm's also the person that seems to be doing a lot more of the active work in putting together this underdog alliance, which again, like, while I'm sure Denise played a factor into it, and the fact that obviously she had these connections with Penner and Jeff Kent and Carter from the original Calabao, those don't end up being that integral by the end, especially when, again, they make this final deal with the connections that Malcolm had. And even despite that, again, they end up being outplayed by the Calabaos early on. Again, they end up losing out on the Jeff Kent vote. Mind you, part of that's due to Penner's mistake, but even then, we're not in a particularly good spot. We do see her getting credit for taking out Artis, which, sure, I guess she brought up Artis' name, but beyond that, again, we don't really see her being that involved from that point forward. Again, at that point, it is Malcolm that creates his Final Four deal that actually sticks to the Final Four when it really shouldn't have. And I think that's the other luck-based factor for me, and the fact that she was on a cast with Michael Skupin, who is as delusional as he is, to where, again, we have Lisa recognizing the move that they should make in taking out Denise at 5, something that they were seemingly close to doing until Michael Skupin shut it down, to where, again, I don't think that's something I really credit Denise much for, where if it was a situation where Skupin was intending on going to the end of Denise the entire time, then maybe I would give her a bit more credit, but he wasn't. He was planning on cutting Denise at 4 at that point anyway. And obviously the other thing is that obviously we get talked about how, oh, she cut Malcolm at the end, but she also almost doesn't, where she does want to go to the end of Malcolm. She is actively striving to go to the end of Malcolm the entire game. Her entire game plan is to go to the end of Malcolm in a situation where she would lose in a near unanimous vote, where the only vote she probably gets is from Artis. So again, I think she gets really lucked out in the fact that Malcolm makes as big a mistake as he does at Final Four. Or if it not for the fact that Malcolm decides to just not lie to her, Denise would try to get to the end of Malcolm, which I think is also really suboptimal play. And really that's for me, again, the big determining factor here for me with Denise is that I just feel like, again, a lot of her post-merge game is really just her not really being that involved in the strategic decision making. She also, again, has some really bad social play with Abby Maria. So while she gets her vote at the end, it's because she's against Skupin and Lisa. I don't think Denise was very likely to get her vote against many other people. But again, it's the fact that she also was just not playing in her best interest. But again, I feel like it's not that dissimilar from how Sandra plays in Heroes vs. Villains, of her just being kind of lucked out the fact that her actual goal doesn't succeed. So while, again, she does end up recognizing the fact that Malcolm is going against her and does flip vote on him at 4, it's also a situation where anyone would recognize that. If you don't recognize that that's something you should do, then you deserve to be lower than Denise. Where, again, I feel like Denise's game is one that I've really gone down on over time. I really just feel like she does not play the post-merge phase of the game particularly well, to where while there is, again, some very impressive play early on, and again, there is obviously a lot of adaptability in her being able to navigate through the game despite the fact that she is so down in numbers, I just feel like her actual path to the win is one where she just was not playing optimally for a lot of it, and again, was not active enough throughout a lot of it for me to where, again, that is enough to put Denise here at number 35. Now, number 34. We're moving on to a winner that, I'll be honest, I had a very tough time assessing this winner. I think this is a person that I very much debated moving much higher on the list. I think this is a person that I considered moving up into my second command tier, though I think the more and more I thought about it, the more I do stick with their original placement from the last list in this more under the radar tier, and that player is Natalie White from Survivor Samoa. And again, Natalie is a very tough player to assess. Again, she's someone that is technically in the majority for the majority of the game. Again, she is working alongside Russell, enabling what Russell does, and through that, again, is in the majority the entire time at Galoo. Never really is in danger, despite the fact that all the other women from that tribe go home in the pre-merge. She's able to survive all that. And then we get to the post-merge, where, while again, Galoo has the majority early on, she's able to, alongside Russell, overcome that. And once they do, she's essentially guaranteed to make it to the end. In a spot where obviously she does have a lot of win equity. She does obviously win against Russell and Mick. She more than likely wins against the likes of Jason and Shambo, to where, again, she had a decent amount of win equity. Again, my debate here was, again, do I consider her a second in command? Do I consider her under the radar? And again, I landed on under the radar simply because I don't think she had that much control over how the game played out. Again, we'll eventually get to it when we talk about my second command winners, but I feel like those people had a lot more agency in how decisions were made on that season. Were a lot more involved in decision making, were looked at as more power players in the game, where Natalie wasn't. Natalie was simply just there. Again, in situations where people talked about the Fofoas and what they were doing, they were always talking about Russell, that Russell is doing this. They're not talking about it as if it's Natalie and Russell doing this. And I think that is a big distinction for me. Where again, we'll talk about someone a lot later in the list that I think there are a lot of comparisons to Natalie White. Yeah, I think that is a person that, again, was lumped in as this duo that is running the game, where Natalie wasn't that. She was simply just the person that is there, that is, again, benefited by the things that Russell is doing, and again, is actively doing so. And again, this is something that I think, again, would make you qualm again, should she be an active under the radar, because I do think she is actively playing an under the radar game in the sense that, again, she has this strategy of she's going to attach herself to Russell, this more domineering presence, this person that's going to do a lot of the legwork. And again, he does end up running a lot of the game. Where really outside of the early merge portion of the game, Russell really runs the show for most of that season. And again, she is someone that's attaching herself to him with the hopes that he will get to the end and not have respect from the jury due to his personality. And again, she does have a correct call in that, but it's still a call that, again, to me, I don't love as a strategy. The notion of banking on the fact that your opponent will essentially burn the jury enough to where you will win. Again, to me, that is, again, a strategy that is much more reliant on what your opponent does over what you do. So again, when we're ranking the winners here, again, I personally have more respect for winners that win based off the merits of what they actually do in the game, more so than them hoping that their opponent messes up in another way. And again, also outside of that, she also someone that, again, was so close to losing. If Brett wins final immunity, she does lose very handily in that situation. And again, I really don't feel like she had that much control over how the game played out. Again, I think a lot of the decisions that were made were primarily made by Russell. Now, the one thing that a lot of people seem to give her credit for is the Eric Cardona vote, yet that has been largely dismissed by a lot of the Galoos, even the Galoos that end up voting for her and saying that that wasn't anything that Natalie really did, and it was a situation where they already didn't trust Eric and wanted him out, to where, again, while her campaigning against Eric, I'm sure played a factor into things, I don't think she was the end-all be-all of that vote, to where I don't really give her that much credit for that. And again, that's really like the only thing in the entire game that she actively does from a strategic point of view. I don't think that's much to really praise her for, even though, again, I think there is obviously good stuff from her socially. Again, she does make very good bonds with a lot of the Galoo women. She made a good bond with Brett. Again, she does do good social work, which obviously does lead to her having a lot of win equity by the end. Again, it leads to her having a lot of respect from the Galoo members and them actively wanting her to win over Russell, to where, again, that is something to definitely give her credit for. But again, I feel like in terms of the navigation through the game, while it is, again, a pretty easy ride for her in the sense that she is never targeted throughout the game, I believe is, alongside Russell, the person that votes out the most people over the course of a singular season. I just feel like she didn't really play that much of a role in making those actual decisions. It just seemed like she was just going along with whatever the majority wanted, to where, again, because that, again, it's tough to really rank her. I could see the arguments for her being higher. I very much considered the arguments for her being higher. Yeah, I think when I come down to it, I just struggled with the concept of me not really just seeing what she actively did in the game outside of, again, attaching herself to Russell, which, again, is good, but just not good enough to be much higher on this list for me. So because of that, for me, she's here at number 34. Now number 33, and I will say number 33 here is the most difficult placement on this list. This is a person I just simply do not know what to do with. This is a person that has really jumped all over the board on this list for me in my prep, to where I just have a tough time wrapping my head around this winner. And I'm sure when I say who this person is, there's going to be people that are upset that this person is above the likes of Marianne and Denise. Yet at number 33, I do have Mike Gabler from Survivor 43. And again, Gabler is such a difficult winner to assess. I think he is a winner that on paper was looked at as a GOAT. Again, that seemed to be a lot of the reason why people were wanting to work with him and dragged him through the game, because they thought they can get to the end with him and win against him. Yet he isn't a GOAT because he wins, to where obviously, again, I don't know if he wins many other situations outside the one he does win, to where while he does handily beat Cassidy and Owen, I do think he struggles in most other jury vote situations. But again, he does win a jury vote very handily in a spot where people did like him. Again, it's not like people hated Gabler and had no real respect for his game. People did seem to genuinely like him, to where I think it was a situation where, again, if he had gotten to the end against the likes of Jesse, Cody, Carla, I think they just respected them more, but it's not like they disliked Gabler in the game. But again, the big question mark for me really came from the notion of, is he active or passive? And this is something that I really thought about for so long coming into this video. Yes, he is a stable presence in the majority alliance, but he doesn't really do much in the majority alliance on paper. There's a lot of reason to look at him as a Natalie White style figure, though I think there are some differences here, particularly in the fact that I think Gabler was a lot more active in his positioning in the game. I think Gabler is someone that seemed to be pretty aware of his winning scenario. Again, he talks about it by the time of the final six, that he thinks that he can win against Cassidy and Owen, and he does end up in that situation. He also made active strives to go in that situation, again, pulling in Owen and cultivating an alliance between the two. Also building a bond with Jesse and Cody, to where through his bond with Jesse and Cody, they end up advocating for him to the jury, proclaiming him as essentially the third in their alliance, which really boosts his overall credibility with the jury. Now, at the end of the day, a lot of the jury members do claim that the reason why he won is because they looked at him going into fire against Jesse as this big move that he made, which again, I don't fully agree with that. I don't think that's really anything from my point of view, but again, obviously that's the way they looked at it. And while I obviously decided on the fact that he is still a passive winner, I do think there are definitely active aspects to his game. It's because I do think he was more adaptable in the game than someone like a Natalie White, who again had this one strategy that she had from the very beginning and stuck to it, and was essentially very much relying on Russell to get her to the end, where I feel like Gabler is a lot more independent here. While again, his game is a lot more rocky in the sense that, again, he is obviously in a not great position early on in the game. Again, kind of like Marianne, where he could have potentially been in danger had they gone to another tribal. I do think it's less secure with Gabler than it is with Marianne, where Marianne I think was 100% goner. I think Gabler's a little bit more up in the air because Gabler would have had an idol, and Gabler also had connection with the guys. Again, who really knows what would really happen there? But still, we do have him getting credit for the Ellie move at the merge, which, again, debatable. I do think, to be honest, it's not really that dissimilar to me from Natalie White targeting Eric Cardona in a situation where Gabler, again, is actively campaigning for Ellie for sure. Again, he is putting her name out there. However, I think it's a situation where Ellie was probably going home anyway, where outside of Gabler campaigning for her, we already see the likes of Jesse and Cody and James being suspicious of her and wanting to take her out anyway. To where, again, I think while Gabler's able to claim that move by the end, it's something that, again, probably was going to happen anyway. And again, he is left out at the Dwight vote immediately following that, which is not great, but really from that point on, he is in the majority the rest of the time, being looped in on the plan, working alongside Jesse and Cody, also having contingency plans with Owen and Sammy, again, building a bond with the likes of Carla and Noelle and Ryan, and again, being aware of his endgame prospects, to where, again, I think Gabler's endgame is actually pretty decent considering the position he was in. Sure, again, I think Gabler is just a very tough player to assess here. Again, he is a player that is just all over the board in my mind. I think he could really be anywhere. Where I think there's arguments for him to being a few spots higher, I think there's arguments for him being lower. Again, I think the fact that his game is as consistent as it is in the endgame stretch is a massive positive for him. Yeah, I think in comparison to the next few winners we'll be talking about, I think those winners had better pre-merge games than Gabler did. Where again, Gabler's not that apart from Marianne in that aspect. However, I also think a negative in comparison to the next few people we talk about is the fact that Gabler's jury prospects are not as strong as those people either. Where while Gabler does win in a 7-1 vote, again, he probably doesn't win against anybody else by the time of the final 8, to where I think that is a genuine criticism to have Gabler's here. So again, I think it's all over the board. However, I think the awareness and his stable presence in the majority through the back portion of the game is enough to put him here at number 33. Now number 32, officially starting the middle tier of the list. We're starting off the new sub-tier here of, again, active under-the-radar players. Again, still players I think were mostly under radar for a lot of the season, though, again, played more actively, again, did more in the game in my mind, having more agency throughout more of the game. But we're going to be starting it off with another winner that also I have a tough time really assessing. I believe this is putting them a bit higher than what they were in my previous list, where I very much teeter on the concept of, is this an active player or passive player? Again, decide to go with active here simply due to the context around their game, and that player is Danny Boatwright from Survivor Guatemala, which again, Danny is a little bit higher here than last time, where last time I did put her in the passive tier. I did end up moving her to the active tier here simply because I do think Danny is someone that it's very unfortunate in the game, to where again, I think there are commonalities with someone like Vecepia in the sense that they were very well positioned on their original tribe, though obviously their tribe was the losing tribe by the time of the merge, and we're just really down in numbers, and through that I think Danny gets very unfortunate in that fact, where again she was in an extremely dominant position early on in the game. Again, it was essentially the main decision maker on her swap tribe, to where she was the one making the decision on taking out Blake or Brian, which to be fair, I don't even know if it's the correct move to be taking out Blake in the spot that she did, but again, it's still a move that she made, and one that again really just shows how much power she had in that portion of the game, to where again, I do think she completely runs the pre-merge of her tribes on this season. But again, once she comes to the merge, she's completely down in numbers, yet despite that, again, she is the last person of her tribe to survive. Again, her entire tribe gets decimated one by one by one until she's the only one left at the final 6, but I think from that point forward, again, I think she plays it pretty well, being able to pull over Rafe, cultivate this really strong relationship with Rafe, to where Rafe decides to take her to the final 3 instead of someone like Lydia, which is pure insanity there, where when Danny wins final immunity, she ends up cutting Rafe at the end there, and has an easy win against Stephanie, even though she probably also easily wins against Rafe. And that's the thing that really propped up Danny here as well, is again, massive win equity on this season. I think she very likely beats most people on this season. Now, I know there is some talk about how the jury loved the Lydia, to where again, who knows against Lydia, I guess, but I think against anybody else, really by the time at the jury phase of the game, outside of maybe Gary, I think she probably just handily beats everybody on the board, which again, I think is very impressive. So again, it is the fact that she does run her initial tribe, and the fact that she is, again, an active participant in the end game, and her actively getting Rafe to keep her in the game. I think those are things that I do give her a lot of credit for. That puts her in this active tier. And again, in comparison to someone like Vecepia, who is obviously much lower on this list, I think you can look at similarities between their games. I think a big difference, again, win equity for Danny. I think Danny has a lot more win equity in the game. Also, again, I think Danny had a lot more direct control in the game at points. For a while, I think Vecepia is probably more stably in a majority group for more of the season. Again, Danny spends pretty much the entire post-merge without a real group. I think Danny, again, plays more actively in those positions than someone like Vecepia does. And again, with Danny winning against most people on the board, again, I do think Danny's game is very impressive here, considering the fact that she comes into the merge down in numbers. Though, again, the reason she's not higher is because, again, she never really was part of any core group post-merge. While she is able to, again, build the strong bond of Rafe that carries her through, she's never able to fully form that into, like, a core alliance that's able to run the show. And I think there's also these question marks around what would happen in the final 6 round. Has she not won immunity there, whereas again she wins immunity through buying advantage at the auction. That again feels a little bit luck dependent, considering again that doesn't happen every round, or again who really knows there. But I do think outside of that, Danny's game here again is impressive considering the context around it. So again, for me, it's enough to put her here at number 32. Now number 31, we're moving on to a winner that brings us back to one of the more recent winners on the board. Actually, the most recent winner on the board. We do have Kenzie Petty from Survivor 46. And Kenzie is a player I also very much debated on where exactly to place her. Now, for me, she was always in this more active tier. So a while you can definitely qualm with decision making at points and the fact that she was kind of out of the loop at points. I believe she's still a player that did have agency throughout the game, even though again she wasn't really the big decision maker at any point in the game. Kenzie goes throughout the entire game without making really any individual move, and even the one that she did plan and taking out Tiffany was a pretty bad one for her to do as early on as she wanted to do it. However, I think the thing that is very impressive for me from Kenzie is her positioning in the game, where she is a player that obviously comes from this very unfortunate pre-merge tribe, going to tribal constantly, where obviously she makes it to the top 3 of that group. I think very likes it makes it to the top 2 of that group. I think if they were to go to tribal again in episode 5, I feel like it's very likely that Tiffany ends up picking Kenzie over Q, and really just in general, I feel like Kenzie was relatively safe for a lot of the early game, to where while we do get a lot of talk about how people are wanting to target Kenzie, it never really felt like a reality of something that was actually going to happen, mostly because of her relationship with Tiffany, and how people were scared to really go against Tiffany. Again, the fact that she was able to cultivate a relationship with someone with that much power in the game, I think is still good play there. But really the thing that actually puts her above the last few people we'll be talking about is the fact that Kenzie was pretty much safe the entire post-merge phase of the game, where again, you definitely qualmed the fact that she was in and out with the majority throughout a lot of it. I still feel like along the way, she is building these really strong social bonds that, again, some pay off, some don't, but through that, again, she's never really in danger. I mean, despite the fact that she does seem to be a pretty formidable final jury threat, again, I don't think the biggest threat on the board. I mean, obviously she wins a 5-3 vote against Charlie, which in itself is kind of a qualm, the fact that it gets that close. But still, I think she probably handily beats Liz. I think against Maria, it's a bit up in the air. So I think that will end up being a close vote, but it probably beats Q, definitely beats Venus. I do think she had a decent amount of win equity on the board, and despite that, was never targeted. The only point where a vote even goes on her is at the final 7 round, where Ben ends up accidentally voting for her, which again stems from her being this planned split vote. That even then probably wouldn't have gone home even if Venus played the idol, or more likely Q would just go out in the revote there, to where, again, I think Kenzie, again, was very safe throughout the game, which is, again, impressive considering the amount of win equity she had. Though, again, I think the fact that she is in and out of the majority is still, again, a bit of a question mark. I think when looking at the post-merge game, again, she is initially safe during the early few rounds. Again, it's kind of left out of the majority group, and kind of like a Marianne spot where her other allies and Q and Tiffany are more involved in the goings-on at the merge. Yeah, she is still relatively safe throughout that. And she takes credit for the Tim move. I don't still know how much credit to really give her for that, but it's at least something that she wanted and something that saves Ben in the game, which is an integral number for her. And she's involved in the Tevin plan, though again, still not a major mover there. The Hunter move is one that I think you can give her credit for. Again, it seems like Hunter doesn't play the idol because of Kenzie, though at the same time, I don't think that was a good move for her. But again, it's something she did. But again, after that, she's left on the outs of the Tiffany vote, involved in the Venus vote, though that's something that she didn't want to happen, which I think are bad. But then again, I think she also makes a pretty decent move in taking out Q in the way that she does, to where again, she's able to convince him to not play his idol. To where again, I think you can still qualm the fact that should she be targeting Q, but again, considering the fact that Q had an idol's probably makes it the right call, but still feels like a situation where she's kind of stumbling into making the right call there. But again, is safe at the final 5 round. And what's also more impressive is the fact that Liz was supposedly being targeted over Kenzie, which is pretty insane considering just it seemed like universally looked on that Liz was not going to win the game. So I really don't understand why that's the case. Now, I think a major detractor from her is the fact that she does kind of lose the battle for Ben's loyalty at the end, where while Ben does, again, try to get her into final 3, which he does by sending her into fire against Liz. Once we get to the final 3, again, Ben would have given Charlie in the case of a tie, which was very close to happening. Even beyond that, I think Ben in general was trying to give Charlie the win, which I think is something to detract from her as well. But Kenzie, I think, is someone that does build a lot of good social bonds. And again, while the likes of Hunter and Liz, people that she had good social connections with, don't end up voting for her at the end, I do think it's her social connection with Tiffany that makes Tiffany a massive advocate for her at the end. Also, she has a good relationship with Venus that gets her jury vote. I think that's also the notion that she plays such a great social game that gets her Tevin's vote. But all in all, again, it is a very rocky game. It's a game that, again, I do think is a bit tough to assess, as it is with a lot of these people we're talking about in this spot. But again, I think in comparison to the more passive, under-radar players, I do feel like she was better positioned than most of those players. And again, in comparison to someone like Natalie White in particular, I think she had a lot more agency in the game, even though, again, how effective was she at many points in the game. But again, I think there are points in the game where you can see that her social ability actually gained her influence in the game, again, getting Hunter not play his idol. Again, at a point, organized the votes to blindside Tiffany, made Q feel comfortable enough to not play his idol. Again, I feel like there are a lot of these points where I think you can see this more active work from Kenzie, sort of mixing that in with her positioning through the game. Again, being in a position where she's really never in danger. The only true spot where she was actually in true danger of going home was the forced fire making twist. Where outside of that, again, she was pretty safe. For a while, again, it was maybe a little bit rocky towards the end of the pre-merge. I do think she would have made it through to where, and I do think Kenzie as a whole, again, definitely has a lot of pros, definitely has a lot of cons, to where, again, I think there are a lot of things that you can compare her to with the likes of Sandra and Vesepia and a Marianne, though I think she does more active work than many of the players that we've talked about so far, to where, while, again, I do think the fact that she got to the end of the game in a relatively safe nature, despite the fact that she should have been in a lot of danger considering she constantly went to tribal in the pre-merge, in comparison to someone like a Denise, to where, again, I think there are similarities there. Again, both having to face a lot of adversity in the pre-merge. While I do think Denise was probably a little bit more in the majority for more of the game, I do think, again, Kenzie was still really safe throughout that period, and also I think was playing more towards her best interests, particularly in the back portions of the game. So I think she was always playing for a winning scenario for her. So again, I think she beats everybody in the endgame stretch outside of maybe Maria. So again, because of all those reasons, she's here at number 31. Now number 30, and at number 30, we're moving on to the top of this active under the radar tier, to the point where I don't even know if that's a good description for this person's game, where this person wasn't really under the radar. They were just simply kind of messy, to where this person was kind of just in and out of the majority, tried a lot of things that just ended up failing, yet despite that also had probably more agency in the game than any of the people we talked about so far. And because, again, another tough winner to assess here, but at number 30, we're going to go with Adam Klein, from Millennials versus Gen X, and again, Adam's game's just, again, messy. I think that's really the main term I would describe him with, is it's really one where he's just constantly in and out of the majority throughout a lot of the game. Now, despite that, he's never really in true danger throughout a lot of the game. While he is being targeted at the time of the merge, he's never really the direct target outside potentially Final 5 had he not had an idol. But again, he does end up being blindsided right away, his first vote of the season, where he has this really strong bottom Mari. Mari gets blindsided out of the game. He's on the bottom at that point. Though, to be fair, he probably doesn't go home after that. Again, it does look like Zeke probably would have gone home if they got into another tribal. And once we do see them swap again, Adam becomes this big swing vote there and ends up being this big decision maker and taking out Figgy, which along the way, he does cultivate this strong bond with Jessica, which allows him to have this other massive ally coming into the merge. Now, again, coming into the merge, again, I think he plays very messily once again. He does try to target Will in a spot where Taylor ends up ratting him out. And we also have this big debacle between Taylor and Adam about the food that Taylor was stealing. And all this puts this massive target on his back. Again, he is the target for the minority group during his first few votes. But really, throughout all this, something that wasn't even on the show is the fact that he is part of the majority alliance at this point. So where obviously we see that him and Hannah and Zeke end up working with the Gen X Alliance, though there was even a more core group than that in reality. And it was those millennials working alongside David, Ken, and Jessica, where again, he also had this final two with Jessica, to where it actually puts him in a pretty decent spot in the game. Obviously, all that unravels when Zeke realizes he's on the bottom and flips to the other side, to where Adam sticks to that group, leading to the rock draw, which again is precarious, obviously. Yeah, I do look at situations where if you do go to a rock draw, that is a failing on you as a player. While there are obviously situations where rock draws are the optimal move for you, I do think this is a situation where, one, it wasn't, and also I do think it still does show a failing on you as a player, and the fact that you weren't able to just outright get the majority. So obviously he gets lucked out there by not getting rocked out, but obviously ends up being in the minority following that vote, only from the flip Will Wall the following round, with part of the reasoning for Will flipping being because he wants to be part of this pendulum strategy and flipping back and forth with Hannah and Adam, which, again, decent on Adam there, though he later leads the charge in the Will blind side, only for him to be outnumbered at the final 7, where again, he wants to target David there, though he simply can't get the numbers in that spot. He also tries to make the move again at 5, only to completely fail there in a spot where, again, he probably goes home had he not been able to find the idol in that round. And I think at the final 4, it's a situation where, while he does get his way and finally getting David out of the game, I don't know how much credit to really give him for that. Where again, from my point of view, it's more so a Hannah and Ken move than it is Adam move, where really he was not that integral to that vote going through, as if he was, then it would have happened beforehand when he previously wanted to go through. To where obviously he does get to the end in a situation where he does win unanimously, and to be fair, was again aware of his jury prospects, knew exactly who he needed to go to the end with, which again is definitely a very good aspect of his game, as I do think he has a lot of awareness of his game, but he also, again, just plays so sloppily throughout all of it that, again, makes it tough to assess him. Again, he's really just all over the board. And again, I think he comes extremely close to just outright losing the game. Again, had he not had an idol at 5, he gets voted out. Had David or Jay snuck into the final 3, which they were very close to doing, so he just outright loses. So again, Adam's game here is very tough to assess. Yeah, I do think, again, he is a very active participant in the game. He is someone that is doing a lot in the game, probably too much, realistically, that gets him in danger. But I think at least his goal in the game is what is in his best interest throughout the majority of it. And obviously does win handily in a jury vote and probably wins against a good chunk of people at the end. So again, if he doesn't get to the end against David or Jay, I do think he is a pretty likely winner by the time of the end game, to where To where, again, in comparison to the people we've talked about so far, the reason I do have Adam at the top of this active under radar tier is because, again, he is much more active in the game, in my mind. So again, I think Adam really fits the active in this active under radar tier. Definitely the most active of the players we've talked about in this tier. Though, again, I do think it is the fact that he is just so inconsistently in the majority is kind of what leaves him back in this under the radar portion of the list, where beyond this, again, we're getting into the second commands, we're getting into the more dominant players of the game, and I don't think Adam really fits in those groupings, where again, because of his sloppiness in the game, I do end up leaving him back here at number 30. Now, number 29, we've now officially moved on to the next sub-tier of the list, the middle sub-tier of the entire list, that being the second command players. Players I do think were involved in what was going on, were part of majority alliances for their entire seasons, and worked alongside a dominant player. Though are players that I don't think did as much as the other person in their pairing, to where, while again, I think they still were an active participant in the game and definitely benefited the other dominant player and how they got through the game, I still feel like for these players that we're about to be talking about, I don't feel like the credit is particularly shared 100% between them and other players, to where that's the reason why they're a step below the more dominant winners of the game. But again, we're going to be starting off at number 29 here with a winner that has gone up quite a bit on the list here. Again, this is one of the biggest jumps up on the list. This is someone that I used to have in the passive under the radar tier. I've now jumped them up to second command. A winner that I do still have qualms with this person's game, and I do think their game was very benefited by the person they were paired up with, yet I still feel like was playing the game mostly optimally. And that elevates her ranking here, and that person is Amber Burkich from Survivor All-Stars. And Amber is one that I used to always have towards the bottom of the list. I remember there was a point where I had her in the bottom 5 winners of all time. However, I do think as time has gone on, I do give Amber a bit more credit for her alliance with Rob and her dominating the game alongside Rob, to where, well, obviously I give Rob a lot more credit for how they dominated All-Stars, with him having a lot of the outside the game relationships that built a lot of alliances, and again, outright saves Amber in the game in the final 10, even though, again, to be fair, she was very much screwed over by a swap to begin with. But still, again, I give a lot more of the credit to Rob. However, I do think Amber is still pretty integral to how the game plays out for them. Again, she is worthy of this second in command distinction. Again, in comparison to someone like Natalie White, where I used to look at them very, very similarly. And to be fair, there are still comparisons to be had. Obviously, winning due to a quote-unquote bitter jury. To be fair, actually, I think Natalie's was even less so. There definitely was a lot of pro-Natalie sentiment there, where with the Amber situation, again, she wins purely because of anti-Rob sentiment. Again, the only vote that was not anti-Rob was Sheehan, though that does lead to one of the bigger positives of the game, to where, again, Sheehan openly talks about how Amber is the biggest threat in the game and tells people that Amber will win when she leaves, and the fact that that doesn't create a target on her back and no one ends up going for her, again, is pretty impressive there. So while, again, I think her overall win equity at the end is very questionable. Again, she barely beats Rob. I do think she struggles to win against anybody else. The fact that she was openly called out as a big threat, and people still looked at Rob and Amber as these big threats in the game, and they never had the shot actually taken at them, again, I think is pretty impressive there. Now, again, how much do you credit that to Amber? But again, I think Amber is someone that, in comparison to Natalie, I think a big difference here is the fact that Rob very much looked at Amber as his second command. Rob very much looked at Amber as someone that he is working with, someone that they are making decisions together, not like Natalie, where Russell, again, didn't care about what Natalie thought and simply just did things on his own. I think that is a major distinction for me here as well, in terms of landing her as a second command. And really also, Amber's game is extremely stable. I mean, she's someone that, outside of her being swap screwed, which again, she gets through, again, how much credit do you give her for that is questionable, but outside of that situation, she is at the top of the pecking order the entire time. And to be fair, a lot of that has to do with the lack of fluidity in Survivor All-Stars, but again, she starts off the game right at the top of the Shapira pecking order alongside Rob. She leads the charge in getting Rob's sister Nino out, being the main voice in needing him to leave the game, in a spot where Rob had good connections with almost everyone else. Her and Rob also have a good bond with Jenna, where once they swap over, again, that cultivates that new Final Four alliance. Now, I will say something that I do definitely knock against her is the Lex situation, particularly in her wanting to actually side with Lex at the merge, only for Rob to get his way there. I think that's definitely a demerit towards her. But again, from that point on, again, she's at the top of the pecking order the entire time, never really in danger. The only point where she would have been in danger is if Jenna had won final immunity. Again, like, her game is just a very stable one, to where, while I think she gets saved due to some things completely out of control, essentially saved due to Rob's pre-gaming, at the final 10. Again, it was still a very unfortunate situation for her to be part of anyway. And when mixing that in, the fact that Amber was in the majority for the entire game, was part of this duo that was looked at as running the game. Again, I think it's a better game than I used to give it credit for. However, I think the big demerit is, again, still her winning prospects. Again, I don't think she beats anybody but Boston Rob. And while she does very good work in maintaining the loyalty of Boston Rob, again, it wasn't because of real game reasons. It was because they were actually falling in love. But still, I do think the fact that she pulls out the win over Rob, with the swing vote, again, being a vote that was pro her from Sheehan, I think is good, even though, again, I still don't love the fact that she wins due to a mostly bitter jury. Again, the other 3 votes were very anti-Rob. And while, again, it's a very valid way of winning the game, it's still a situation that is very luck dependent. It's very dependent on what your opponent does more so than what you do. And through that, for a list like this, where we're comparing all the winners, I do think if you win the game from a more anti-your opponent sentiment than a pro-you sentiment, I think that is a knock to have here. To where, and that's the reason why she is at the bottom here of the second command winners, but still a better game than what I used to give her credit for, and because that she's here at number 29. Now number 28, we're moving on to a very similar winner here, one that I think has a lot of the same pros and cons as Amber, though I think is someone that was a bit more involved in the overall strategic decision making, and that person is Sophie Clark from Survivor South Pacific. And Sophie I've always had around this spot. I mean, Sophie is a pretty solid middle tier winner in my mind. Again, someone that was in the majority lines the entire time, was, again, active participant within it. Again, while I do think Coach definitely deserves credit for specific individual moves, again, Sophie was still able to get Coach to remain loyal to her the entire time, and again, still was influencing how the game played out. Now, like Amber, I do feel like her winning prospects are not great. I mean, I think she pretty much wins one of the only situations she can possibly win, which, to be fair, again, she recognized that, and this is an active decision she made, and wanting to drag Coach to the end because she thought that he couldn't win was a correct call. But again, as I said before, again, it's very dependent on what your opponent is going to do, though to be fair, she had more reason to think that considering she had seen Coach on previous seasons. Again, she just plays a very solid game. I will say, in comparison to Amber, I do think there's probably a part of the game where she has a bigger flaw, where I do think her trying to save Michaela and failing at that is definitely not good. I mean, that shows her not having the control in her tribe. Coach had more control in the game, but outside of that, though, again, she's just stably on the top the entire time. Again, fitting in with a group that she simply should not fit in with. Again, a group that is largely based around religion and faith, something that Sophie doesn't really connect as much with, which, again, Sophie's inclusion in this alliance has always felt very strange. But again, I think that is impressive that she's able to be in this alliance that she should have no real part in. But again, like, at the end of the day, I don't look at her game as that dissimilar from Amber's. I do think they are pretty similar in most aspects. Again, on top of the pecking order for most of the season. Again, don't have great winning odds. They do end up winning in their situations. So I will say, I do think Sophie's endgame is a little bit less secure than Amber's, where Sophie is someone that had to win that final immunity against Ozzy, where had that not happened, she probably is voted out at 4. Even beyond that, she's also someone that was being targeted back at the Brand Hance vote and also the Rick vote, to where those aren't great situations to be in, though. Again, I still think as a whole, I think Sophie was a more strategically active version of Amber, to where while I think she probably has more minor holes along the way, I feel like the pros are enough to squeak her right above Amber here at number 28. Now, number 27, pretty much getting to the definitive second command player in my mind, the person who is just the first person that comes to my mind when I think of someone that is second command, that goes on to win the game, and that person is Ethan Zohn from Survivor Africa. And Ethan is a tough player to assess in the fact that I do very much question how much of his game is intentional. I do think his game is one where, yes, he was second command to Lex. They did work together throughout most of the game, alongside Big Tom also, but I do think Ethan's winning scenarios are a bit rocky, where while he obviously wins against Kim, and again, does very good relationship building with Kim, to where that essentially ends up winning him the game by the very end, he also was not planning on going to the end with Kim. He wanted to go to the end with Lex. A situation where, again, I think he barely wins if he even does, to where, again, it probably comes down to one vote, which, again, I don't love that. I also think there's points in the game where he isn't playing particularly strategically. Again, very much trying to play into the honor and loyalty of the game, which I don't love, but I do think there are points in the game where he does make some pretty good moves. Again, I think the move to throw the immunity challenge to take out Silas is a very impressive move, especially for this early on in the series. For someone like Ethan, someone that is a professional athlete, to throw an immunity challenge to take out his biggest threat, I think that is a pretty impressive play that early on in the show. I also think the move to take out Brandon is a pretty good play from him as well. Again, weakening Lex through making the move, and putting him in a pretty good spot moving forward. Though, again, I think the big qualm for me is that while, again, him, Lex, and Big Tom really run the show from beginning to end and is on paper the best positioned of those people, I just don't know how much of that was active play. And again, it just feels like he sabotaged his game by the end of the game, yet kind of wins despite that because Kim wins the final few immunities. So I think that is probably the biggest question mark for me on Ethan's game. But again, Ethan still wins at the end against Kim. Again, struggles against Lex, but that's pretty much the only other person he struggles with. I think he literally beats everybody else on this cast. The only person he would maybe struggle with is maybe like T-Bird, but I think he's someone that very likely wins against most other people on this cast. Again, I think he is someone that has essentially 3 guaranteed votes in almost every situation and just needs one more. Considering that in his positioning in the game, again, I think it is still a pretty impressive game, and one that, again, is the pretty definitive second command game. I just wish there was a bit more agency in him actively striving to get into his best case scenario at the end instead of just kind of lucking out into it. But again, he's still someone that was never really in danger the entire way, and again, had more win equity than the last 2 people we talked about. So for that, for me, he's here at number 27. Now, number 26, we're moving on to what is already the top of the second command tier, and that has gone up in my ranking here since last time. I mean, last time I would have had him in the active under the radar tier. Yeah, I kind of realized that was kind of flawed after really thinking it through. So at number 26 here, we do have Aris Bukauskas from Survivor Panama, and Aris's game is, again, one that I do have issues with. Like, I do think Aris, like, in a way, kind of reminds me of my opinions of Adam, not necessarily in how they played the game, but more so in just, like, kind of how messy his game is. I mean, where, again, there definitely are points where his game is pretty rocky. I think if he were to go to first tribal, he is probably a dead man walking, though, again, who really knows what would happen there. Though also, again, how likely was it that the young men were going to lose the first immunity challenge? But then even after getting to Kasaya, while he is part of the initial majority alliance, he also has some poor play there, again, like openly telling Melinda that she's going home. He tries to keep Bob Dog in a situation where Bob Dog was just going to flip on him, come into the merge, where while he is pretty well positioned at that point in the game, again, I think there's still some questionable play here and there. But again, they get to the merge, and by that point, he's essentially in a pretty decent position. Again, in a position where he's essentially perceived as the leader of this majority alliance, looked at as Kasaya's strongest member, to where he's essentially kept in the game as this person to face off against Terry. And to be fair, I think that is something to knock against him. The fact that I think he was very fortunate that Terry was in the game, and because Terry had stayed in the game for so long, people felt like they need to keep Aris in the game because they need him to beat Terry. I still think there is some pretty good play in all this. I mean, again, he still is able to cultivate a really strong relationship with Cirie, which again is the reason why he's in the second command tier. Again, I do think he is the second command to Cirie. I think Cirie is someone that is a lot more integral to the decisions that they make, someone that actually creates the strategies that they do. Aris is someone that is alongside her, and Aris is someone that I think benefits most from actually the moves that Cirie makes, where based on what we've heard from the jury, it's very likely that Aris would have beaten Cirie had they gotten to the end together, which again was a situation that Cirie was actively striving for, to where again, that is a lot of the reason why Aris is at the top of this year at this point, because despite Aris being the beta in this dominant duo, he's also the person that more than likely wins of that duo, but also not in a way that he is winning due to this bitter jury, because of this jury that doesn't want to reward the person they're up against, but more so as in pro-Aris sentiment. Again, people respected Aris's challenge ability and him being out in front from the Kasaya tribe, or while there definitely were people that were detractors. And again, I don't think he particularly handles his relationship with Shane well at the end, where I don't think it was necessarily in his best interest to backstab Shane. He's still able to maintain the jury votes of the old Lamina people, specifically Terry, someone that he had an open feud with, and the fact that he was able to garner that respect there, I think, is something to praise him for, along with the fact that he does do good work in getting Danielle to take him to the end, where, while I do think he probably strong arms her a bit too much, it's still effective play and gets him into his winning scenario, where straight, I think Aris beats a lot of people on this season. I think outside of Terry, I think he probably beats most people by the time the end game, specifically due to the fact that he essentially has 3 guaranteed votes from the Lamina people and just needs one more, which if Cirie is on the jury, he pretty much gets that vote every single time. To where, again, I think in retrospect, I do have more respect for Aris's game on this season. I do think it's one where I look at him as a second command to Cirie, and while I do have problems with some strategic decisions he makes along the way, I think in comparison to someone like Ethan in particular, again, I think he's essentially just a better version of Ethan. I think he is a more active version of Ethan, and someone that is more intentional in the way that he plays the game than Ethan, to where, while Ethan is probably someone that's more palatable to the other members of the cast, I still feel like Aris essentially does most other things better than Ethan on this season, to where, with that in mind, I did end up putting him here number 26. Now number 25, and now we are starting the next sub-tier on the list, the top sub-tier of the middle tier, which is actually the biggest sub-tier on this list. So this is a tier that actually caused some big shifts in this list here. Some people that I used to consider top tier winners, I moved down because of the creation of this tier. And this tier is the semi-dominant tier, to where what I'm essentially talking about here is essentially players that had dominant aspects of their games. Again, did run the show at portions of the season, but did not run the show for the entire season. Where, again, we'll get to the top tier to list. Those players are all dominant players that ran the show from beginning to end with very few points where they were outside of the majority. This is a tier where there are people that are going to be outside the majority, or people that didn't have as much agency at points in the game, yet there are specific portions of the game where they had a lot of agency and had a lot of control. So that's kind of the basis of this tier, which again does lead to some people that I used to consider top tier winners moving down into this tier, though again that'll be for later in this tier. But the tier itself again is pretty big here, but we're going to be starting it off at number 25 here with a winner that again perfectly fits into this tier. Again, a player that I think had some very impressive play at points, that also had some very sloppy play as well. And that player is Nick Wilson from Survivor David vs. Goliath. And Nick is a player that again just has a game that's just all over the board. I think there are points in this game where Nick plays a very impressive game, where really I feel like outside of the first round, I feel like his game up until the final 9 is actually really impressive. It's a game where he's essentially playing from the bottom for most of that, yet still has a lot of control and agency along the way. Again, despite the fact that he is immediately a massive target on the David's tribe, which again is a fault for sure. Again, the fact that he is potentially the first boot of that tribe had Pat Cusack not been medevac from the game, which again is still up for debate. Again, there are people that say that they would have tried to save him. Again, you never really know what would have happened, but still, again, that is definitely a major qualm to be had with his game. But the fact that he recovers from that almost instantly, again, he then becomes a massive swing vote at the second round of the game, instantly recovering his position and creates this alliance with Christian, has this relationship with Davey, is pulled into this group, the Blindside, Jessica P, all that very impressive play already by the second round of the game. But he proceeds to be in the middle until the time of the swap, to where again, he gets a very unfortunate swap. He is put on the bottom right away at the swap. Despite that, again, he plays very well, again, cultivating a really good relationship with Mike, cultivating a really good relationship with Angelina, to where he's able to survive through the merge despite going to tribal twice. And then once we get to the merge, again, despite coming into the merge down in numbers where David's were kind of screwed on paper, again, I think he plays it particularly well. Again, he is able to be part of the stealth force and build a good relationship with someone like an Alec, to where that ends up leading to him being able to pull off the John Hennigan move, where Alec talks about how he can't let Nick be blindsided by his vote, which is like, why? Which again, I think is a massive pro to Nick's game. The fact that Alec essentially sabotages his own plan because he felt like he needed Nick's loyalty. Again, that allows him to pull off the John Hennigan move, which I still think is one of the most impressive individual plays in the history of the show. Again, pulling off this minority vote split and setting up the stage for them taking control the following round, where they utilize the idle nullifier and the vote steal to take out Dan Rengering. And again, up to that point, I think his game is fantastic. It is on the edge of a top tier game. The problem is that his game from that point on is a lot more sloppy. Now, again, it is not without its pros. Again, there are still good things that happen in his end game, but there's still a lot of qualms to be had. Again, he is blindsided the final 9. Not a good situation there. He also takes it very personally, where again, it just felt like him opening up the opportunity from the burn relationships through how pissed he was, but still, he's able to still be involved in the next few votes. Again, he is the person to mention that they should split the votes on Gabby. That leads to Gabby being taken out when Christian plays his idol at 8. He is also one of the people involved in taking out Christian, which straight up I do think is questionable. While he definitely need Christian out of the game at some point, I do think Christian was also a massive shield for him, to where while, again, he felt very confident in his relationship with Mike and Angelina, I still think it was probably not the optimal move to make at 7, but still, at 6, he loses Davey. Again, another demerit towards his game. Again, his end game ends up being very rocky, where he essentially wins out. He does win those final few challenges. The question is, does he need to win out? Which I still don't even know the proper answer, where I know Mike White has claimed that he was always planning on taking Nick to the end. Yeah, I do feel like they had the open shot to take him out. It does feel weird for him to not take it, though, to be fair, they also thought Allison was a big threat, and in general, again, I lean on the fact that he probably didn't need those challenges, but still a situation that, again, is not ideal. Again, he is being blindsided and left out of the vote at 6, and again, I think kind of just stumbles his way to the end, even though, again, I think he had the safety net of having this relationship with Mike and Angelina that I think is something that is definitely this big pro for him. And really, in general, again, I think his game is, again, perfectly fitting into this semi-dominant game. I think his mid-game is, again, very impressive. Again, despite the fact that he is on the bottom, he's still able to cultivate a lot of relationships and social capital to pull off some really impressive moves, and is very adaptable in the game. Though, again, I do think the fact that things do go wrong for him pretty often on this season, again, almost the first boot of the season, blindsided at the Carl vote, blindsided the Davey vote. Again, that track record is not great, but again, I do think it's the fact that he had as much agency as he did at many portions of the game, along with the fact that he handily wins at the end. Again, I think he beats most people in the final vote, where by the time that Christian goes home, I think he probably beats everybody there, but maybe Allison, even that's a little bit up in the air to where, again, I did think Nick plays a pretty impressive game despite him having many holes in his game, but those holes are enough to put him here at number 25. Now number 24, moving on to another winner that again completely fits into this semi-dominant tier. Someone that was in a dominant position for portions of the game, but also lost control at portions of the game, and that person is Chris Doherty from Survivor and Uatu. And Chris is a tough player to assess, where I do feel like he was in a very good position in the first half of the game. Again, I think he was completely running the men's tribe, being in a very strong position, and being the best position of those people, which is all very, very impressive, despite the fact that, again, he was targeted in the first vote by the opposition, though, again, that was simply because of his poor challenge performance. But even at the swap, again, he's put in a pretty good position, where, again, he's once again in a power position, still with the majority from the men, also has a connection to John Kenny, who is on the outside, also building relationships with the likes of Twyla and Julie that really benefits him down the road, where, again, I think it's a very good game in the first half. However, I do think he makes a misstep. Obviously, the decision to take out John Kenny, I think is questionable. Now, I understand the logic for it in the fact that he just simply didn't trust John Kenny and thought he was an unreliable number coming to the merge. But again, I still think the fact that he trusts Twyla and Julie more so than John, where, again, where was John really going, I think is a questionable move, which obviously leads to him being down in numbers coming to merge, where had they kept John Kenny, I did think John Kenny would have stuck around for a single round, where it allowed them to at least maintain the numbers initially. So again, because of that, he's down in numbers coming to merge, essentially being dragged to the slaughter. Again, he loses his allies and Rory, Sarge, and Chad along the way, only for the vote to flip at the final 7, a situation that I don't give him that much credit for. I do feel like it's a situation where he doesn't do much. Actually, really, he does the complete opposite of doing anything. The point is that he doesn't do anything, which allows the women to actually win each other. But again, I still think it's a kind of a luck-based situation for Chris. It's a situation where he doesn't do much to really save himself there, outside of the active decision to not do anything. Though I think in that spot, you can give him some credit for building the relationship with Julie, which keeps Julie supporting him, and mixing that the fact that, again, I think he gets kind of lucky in the fact that the family visit happened there, and the women feeling bad for his girlfriend, her losing the challenge for him, kind of led to him gaining the sympathy to survive the final 7 round. But again, all that kind of luck-based circumstances. But even then, I think no matter what, Twyla and Scout were still always going to want to make the move anyway. And we do see Chris, again, play a role in that for sure. Again, he pulls in Eliza, but again, it was still a plan where he had to be roped in by Twyla to even do to begin with. And again, I do think that it is that middle portion of the game, again, from the final 10 to final 7, that is just very rocky for Chris. But obviously from that point forward, his game really recovers. Now, I still think there's questionable play. I still don't agree with how he plays Eliza and Julie through those following rounds. I do feel like he is unnecessarily burning them in a spot where it's just going to potentially burn their jury votes, where obviously he still keeps their jury votes by the end, but he's still risking it for not enough benefit from my point of view, especially Julie in particular, where at least with Eliza, he felt very secure in the fact that obviously Eliza's never going to vote for Twyla and Scout. But for Julie, again, I think he's really playing with fire and how he handles her. Now, I will say something I do give Chris a lot of credit for is the fact that he was actually able to get Twyla to turn on Scout, where they do create a final 2, and if Twyla had one final immunity, she supposedly was going to cut Scout, which I think is, again, very impressive for Chris. Very good aspect of his positioning in the game. But again, I just have qualms with, again, jury management at points, even though, again, he has a great final tribal that wins back those votes. I think he again, kind of burns Julie unnecessarily. And again, I think it's his own misstep that caused him to come into merge down in numbers, where had he come to merge with numbers, I think he just has an easy road to the end, and Dufert probably ends up being in the top tier of this list. But because he actively messes up in that position and loses the numbers coming to merge, again, that's why he's this low on the list, because again, it's a position where, again, he definitely did have a lot of control early on in the game. Again, was really running the show on his side of the game for the first half of the game, but then completely loses that control and kind of gets lucked out by certain situations by the end, where while he is able to better his position by the tail end of the game, again, it's not quite enough to move him back into the top tier, to where, again, it's a rocky game, still a pretty good one, which ends up landing him pretty much right in the middle of the list here at number 24. Now number 23, and again, we're at the middle of the list, finally. And at 23, we have a winner that I've always found very difficult to assess, because obviously this is a very different winner than most seasons of the show, and that is obviously the first ever winner. At number 23, we do have Richard Hatch. And again, Richard Hatch's game is just kind of an anomaly. It's one where, again, you could definitely say he played a dominant game in the sense that he was in this alliance that runs the show from pretty much beginning to end. I mean, really from like episode 5 until the end. But despite that, again, it's a position where I don't know how much credit to really give him for the success of that alliance. Where, while obviously he's credited nowadays as the person that created the alliance, he simply didn't. Where actually he was one of the last people involved in the alliance. It was Sue and Kelly that created this alliance first. And even before that, we saw Kelly making other alliances. Really, Hatch just seemed to be kind of just dangling in the tribe, not really in a power group for the beginning portion of the game. Though, again, he does build this strong bond with Rudy, and there's also they're benefited by outside influences and keeping Rudy in the game. But still, again, he is able to build this Final Four alliance that really runs the show coming into the merge. They pull off this Gretchen blindside and really utilize Sean as a number moving forward. Again, it allows them to really just run the show. Though even despite that, again, he loses the loyalty of Kelly along the way, putting him in a more precarious spot there. Also gets to a Final Four where he's almost taken out there as well. Where while, again, there's definitely some bad luck there and Kelly winning immunity that causes him to be in danger. Again, it's still a tie vote where Kelly switches her vote for no real reason and had no incentive in doing so. I definitely question that as well. But again, obviously I think he plays the final 3 round really well. Again, throws immunity, gets Kelly to still take him to the end. Again, very good move there. And obviously he wins in a 4-3 vote in a situation where supposedly he was going to win by more before Sue made her speech. So again, it's a good game. It is one where he is in a majority alliance the entire way. He is mostly safe for a lot of the game, even though, again, there are some rocky points. And again, did have Kelly pretty handily beat until things outside of his control turned votes away from him. But in comparison to the other winners, particularly from this point forward, I do feel like those winners had a lot more control in how the game played out, where I feel like Hatch, again, was in the majority the entire time. Wasn't really dictating the vote. I mean, really, for a lot of the post-merge phase of the game, he wasn't dictating the vote really at all. He was simply just attaching himself to whatever Sean wanted to do, which allowed them to get numbers. And again, even then, and again, wasn't even in an alliance until towards the end of the pre-merge, and even in that spot, he's not even the initial foundation of that alliance. And again, gets kind of saved due to things outside of control at the Final Four. And again, it's definitely a very rocky game. Still, again, pretty impressive game for Season 1. Really mostly dominant performance. Yeah, I just feel like in terms of his game in comparison to the people we're going to be talking about, I feel like those people had a lot more active strives through the game than Richard had, to where it feels like his game is largely benefited from the fact that people just simply didn't want to play the game. So while, again, he will get credit for creating this innovative thought of the alliance, but in reality, everyone knew about the concept of an alliance. They just simply didn't think it was the moral way to play the game, and through that just actively didn't work in an alliance. Well, again, obviously give credit to Rich and the Toggies for recognizing that being in an alliance doesn't mean that you're a terrible person, but it still does lead to him facing off against much worse competition that isn't even playing the same game that he is playing, making his road a lot easier, to where, considering that he still wasn't even able to properly run the show the entire way, I do feel like, again, it leads to me having him, again, here in this semi-dominant tier, here at number 23. Now, number 22, we're moving on to our first winner in a while that I've actually not talked about in the past on my previous winner ranking, and a winner that might be much higher than what people are expecting for people that just simply watch the show and watch my initial player ranking for this season, as my opinion on this person's game has radically shifted over time, and that person is Erica from Survivor 41. And again, at the time that Survivor 41 ended, I would have had Erica as one of the worst winners. I think she was someone that, at the time, I thought of her as someone that was directly saved by the hourglass twists, or had that not happened, she would have gone home. Someone that also was a massive target in the early game and would have been taken out had Luven been successful in throwing the immunity challenge. And someone that didn't seem to have that many winner prospects, and seemed to also someone that, while she does win at the end, seemed to be winning due to relatively weak competition and would have lost against many of the other people in the cast. Yet, really, at the end of the day, all of this is just not true. Where through Exit Press and through obviously having a wider outlook on how the game of 41 played out, I think the reality is Erica is, again, perfectly fitting in this semi-dominant tier. Again, I think the notion that she was going to be booted in the pre-merge had they gone to Tribal, that's simply not true. Again, that has been debunked after the fact. The Sean has openly stated that that storyline was pretty much manufactured, and that the entire plot to throw the immunity challenge was not to take out Erica, it was actually to take out Sydney, which, again, through that, again, it's a massive pro for Erica. It's the fact that she was essentially in a very strong position early on in the game then. Again, she had a close relationship with Heather. She had a very close relationship with the Sean, so she should have been pretty lock safe on the original Luvu tribe. Moving forward into the merge, again, we obviously get the criticism of her being saved by Hourglass, which, to be fair, is not necessarily untrue now. However, now realizing that, again, she wasn't a target coming into the merge, it also makes you realize that, well, she was only targeted at the time of the Hourglass because of the Hourglass, because she was gone from tribe. That made it very easy for people to just throw her under bus. And even then, who knows if that would have changed by the time of Tribal. Or again, considering that this was essentially all based around the fact that she was just simply gone and it was easy to throw her under bus, when she got back to camp, again, who knows if that would have changed. changed at that point. Now, I do think there is some criticism to be had, and the fact that she never has that much control in the game for the early portions of the game. Again, while she is, again, relatively safe, she's not really dictating the vote, and again, does potentially go home at a split vote tribal. She doesn't win immunity, though even then, I still think Ricard would have saved her. And again, that is definitely a pro for her. Again, the fact that she cultivates these good relationships with Xander and Ricard. That really leads me to my next point, and the fact that Erika essentially runs the game from the final 8 on. Like, once the Shan move happens, which again is a move that I do give more of the credit to Ricard for making, he essentially takes the reins from that point. Again, while Ricard is the one to make that move, he's also the person to take the brunt of the blame for that move, becoming the biggest target on the board because of that move. Yet, despite that, Erika's actually the one to maintain the majority alliance at that point, and she has these relationships with Heather and Xander while also having the connection to Ricard that keeps them in the majority while also really keeping Ricard's fate in her hands. Again, she can really flip on him at any point in the game and he will go home, while also still maintaining numbers, even if he does go home. So again, at that point in the game, I think she plays extremely well. Again, is able to take some of the credit for the Shan vote and her being able to split the vote onto Shan. She also, again, keeps the vote onto Liana and keeping Ricard as a shield, only to take him out at 5. And then also is the main orchestrator of the Dany vote, where that was a situation where she was closer to Deshawn and wanted to keep Deshawn in the game, even though, again, to be fair, Deshawn throws her under bus at tribal. But again, she still gets her way in that situation, where I think a big qualm for me comes to the final 4, where from what we've seen, again, she's not a particularly good fire maker and potentially would have lost had she gone into fire, and kind of gets lucked out due to this perception that she was on exile and made fire on exile, that people thought she was a good fire maker, that made Xander scared of putting her into fire. Though again, it's still impressive that she was able to stay out of fire in that spot, even though again, I don't know how much of that's a really credit for her. But again, bringing me to the final point that I mentioned earlier, the fact that again, at the time, I did look at Erika as someone that would not win in most situations, that while she won in the situation that she got, she was someone that was not likely to beat some of the earlier people in the game, like Ricard or Dany, when in reality, I feel like she beats all of them, if not comes very close. Or again, from the talk about the votes that we've heard after the fact, Ricard was not as well respected as what the show seems to point him out as, where while he definitely would have gotten votes, I do think it would have been a very close vote between him and Erika. Well, against someone like Dany, I think she just outright beats him, probably just barely getting more votes than someone like Deshawn. So again, I think Erika's game, in retrospect now, is a pretty good one. It's one where, while again, I do wish she had more agency early on in the game, was actively doing more things early on in the game, I do feel like she really makes up for that in the back third of her game, which I think is her essentially running the game from the final 7 on, with her also being relatively safe throughout most of the game outside the Hourglass situation, which was very luck dependent. So where again, I do think Erika's game, in retrospect, is actually a pretty solid one here. But again, she's still in this semi-dominant tier and kind of in the middle of it, simply because, again, she just simply was not really running the show until the tail end of the game. But it's still a solid game through and through, which is why she's here at number 22. Now number 21. And now we're getting to 2 winners back-to-back here that are very tough to assess. And really, the next 4 winners that I'll be talking about in this semi-dominant tier are all winners that used to be in my top tier. These are all people that, before reorganizing the list for this video, were people that I would have considered top tier winners. Yeah, I feel like these next 2 in particular are very tough in the sense that there's also aspects of them being second command winners as well. And I really much debated where exactly to land them, where I, at a point, very much considered putting them in second command. However, the more I thought about it, I felt like they had a lot more agency than a lot of the second command winners to jump them up a bit, but I didn't feel like they were dominant enough to be quite in the dominant tier. So again, these people were very rocky, but at number 21, we're going to be starting off this grouping with Yam Yam from Survivor 44. And Yam Yam is a winner that I was very high on at the time. Again, looking at him being part of the Tika 3 and him running the show alongside them and being a pretty integral number for that grouping success, while also winning at the end in near unanimous vote. Again, I gave him a lot of credit at the time. I don't know how much credit I give him now, where again, Yam Yam ends up being a very tough player to assess here in the sense that, yes, he was running the game alongside Carson. However, I do give Carson a lot more of the credit now. Again, to me, I do look at Yam Yam more so as a second command to Carson. Carson was the person really running the show, while Yam Yam was there as backup, though really also didn't really get his way a lot of the time. Again, where I do think there's a lot of points where Yam Yam doesn't really get his way strategically, and really I think that's the biggest flaw of Yam Yam's game in general, is strategically. I don't think he's a particularly good strategic player. I don't think he really has a good strategic mind for the game, where I think he really needs this Carson figure to navigate through the game for him, as again, I think there's many points where he wanted to remain loyal to Rat2, only for Carson to steer him in the other direction. We also have him wanting to target Carolyn at a point, only for Carson to also turn him from that. We also have him wanting to actively take Carson to the end in a situation where, from most of the jury, it seems pretty clear that he would have lost against Carson at the end. And all that is very bad, especially mixing out of the fact that early on in the game, again, he kind of mishandles Carolyn, and could have potentially been voted out, even though I think he would have been pretty safe by the time of the episode 5 tribal if they had gone to tribal. But again, I think it is an inconsistent game. It's one that Jam Jam, even more so than the next person we'll be talking about, I very much consider just dropping him outright to the second command tier. However, I just very much struggle with doing so, particularly in the fact that I do think Jam Jam was still a very integral figure in the Tika 3 success. Again, if Carolyn had gone to win, I think Carolyn would be more so in the second command tier. Again, I think she's someone that was part of the Tika 3, but was not that integral to their success, even though she did still have agency at points. I think Jam Jam was a lot more integral to their success. Where again, Jam Jam and Carson really worked together in a lot of the things they were doing, and they had a Final Four alliance separately from the Tika 3 with Jamie and Lauren, with Jam Jam really doing a lot of the legwork and pulling in Jamie in particular, which is a lot of the reason why they are as successful as they are, which again is a major reason why I do have Jam Jam this high, is because I do feel like that was such an integral relationship in how this season plays out. So I do feel like he should be credited with a level of dominance in the game, along the fact that he is also really safe in the game, where outside of these more unlucky circumstances where Josh gets swapped over with an idol in his pocket, or he gets swap screwed at the split tribal where him and Matt are the only options, or really just in general coming into Mergatory where him and Josh are the easy targets. Really, again, he is a potential target in those spots, but again, those are all pretty unlucky circumstances. And once he gets through those spots from the final 10 on, he is pretty safe the rest of the way with a lot of win equity. I think Jam Jam is someone that beats literally everybody in the game outside of Carson, which again makes the issue of him wanting to go to the end of Carson even grander. But still, again, for someone that has that much win equity in the game, I think it is still a very impressive spot to be in, especially considering how active he was in the game. But again, I do think he is just a very strong social player. Again, built these strong bonds with a lot of the Ratus, had a strong bond with Heidi, has Heidi wanting to take him to the end, and in general, again, I think plays a very impressive game still. I do think, again, there's definitely an argument for him being lower with how many strategic fallacies he seems to have, and again, there being certain points in the game where he doesn't necessarily get his way, but I do think as a whole, I do look at Jam Jam's game pretty favorably, despite those issues, which is why he's here at number 21. Now, number 20, we're moving on to a winner that, again, I think is alongside Jam Jam. Another player that you can debate is a second command. I think you could also debate this person as a dominant winner. Again, last time I did my ranking, he was in the dominant tier. I did consider him as a co-dominant winner. I think at this point, again, I'm a little bit lower than that. Yeah, again, still in the semi-dominant tier here, and that person is Wendell Holland from Survivor Ghost Island. And again, Wendell is a player that obviously ran the show alongside Dominic. Now, I think as time goes on and having just rewatched Ghost Island, I would give Dominic a lot more of that credit. I do think Dominic ran the show a bit more. I mean, we do see Dominic in a lot more of the one-on-one conversations, being the one to actively lead votes in certain directions, where while I do think Wendell was for sure involved in how votes played out, and I think there are definitely points in the game where Wendell was better positioned than Dominic, where really throughout the entire early portion of the game, I think Wendell was always better positioned than Dominic. And even like coming into the merge, had a better relationship with Chris than Dominic. And again, there are definitely points where Wendell is safer in the game than Dominic. Yeah, I think Dominic is doing a lot more of the legwork and getting the votes to go through. Which again, you can definitely credit to Wendell, where I do think part of it is active on Wendell's side, where he did want Dominic to be the one out in front while he'd be kind of like the nice guy in the situation. But again, I think when in comparison to a lot of the winners that we're going to be talking about moving forward, I think a lot of them had much more apparent agency in the game than Wendell. Now again, I think Wendell does have some impressive moments. Again, split tribal, that's a situation where he's able to get Kellen to go after Laurel and Laurel to go after Kellen, keeping him safe in that position, which I think is pretty good, even though, again, if Laurel had been taken out in that spot, which she came very close to doing so, I think that would have been pretty bad for Wendell, considering how integral of a number Laurel was for him. But again, I also give Wendell a lot of credit for keeping Laurel's loyalty, where I think a lot of that comes from her relationship with Wendell, where, again, Laurel was in this position where she could have easily flipped the entire game and worked alongside the women and targeted Dom and Wendell, yet never does, and I think a lot of that comes from Wendell's relationship, which is the reason why, again, I struggle with putting him in the second command tier. While I do think Wendell, again, was not as active of a player as someone like Dominic, and I think Dominic was very clearly the alpha of the duo, I do feel like Wendell still does things on his own, and he has these really integral relationships that keep them in power, where, again, he is co-dominant in the game, does maintain some of those relationships along the way. I still think has some faulty jury management at points. Or again, him bickering with Donathan's not great, though obviously he's benefited from the fact that Dominic also bickered with Donathan. And obviously a big qualm to be had, though, is him barely winning. Again, he only wins in a 5-5 vote in a situation where Dominic had 5 guaranteed votes, meaning that Wendell had to win all of the other ones, and he barely does, where again, Angela vote is one where Angela literally votes for him because Wendell just so happened to be looking at her at the moment where she was deciding on who to vote. To where again, I think him winning there is a very luck-based position, but it's also one where, again, in comparison to Jam Jam just outright loses against Carson. Wendell beats his Carson again, it might be rocky, it might be very close, but again, I think with a Jam Jam Carson final 3, I do think Jam Jam outright loses to Carson near unanimously. To where again, I think Wendell being in this position where he gets a 5-5 tie, squeaks it out by the end, I think that's another pro for Wendell in comparison to Jam Jam, to where, again, I think at the end of the day, again, I think Wendell and Jam Jam games are pretty similar. However, I think at the end of the day, I do look at Wendell as a more stable strategic presence through the game, and also one that, again, had better win equity for the most part, to where I think Wendell's game here is very, very impressive, despite him not being the alpha in his grouping, which again ends up being enough to put him here at number 20. Now number 19, and at number 19, we have 2 more winners left in this semi-dominant tier. Both winners, again, that were in my top tier last time, and I think this one in particular will be one that people aren't particularly happy with. Yeah, I think as time goes on, I think this is a placement I do stand by. At number 19, I do have Natalie Anderson from San Juan del Sur, and again, Natalie's game I think is very good. I think the way that she plays from Final 9 on is extremely impressive. The fact that she's able to turn around a position where she is blindsided by the Jeremy vote into a position where she's reintegrated within the alliance that blindsided her and really plays the middle from that point on and snipes out her targets one by one and makes the Baylor move that essentially wins her the game by the time of the Final 4, and all that is extremely impressive. My issue is that, again, it only starts at the Final 9. Where before that, I think her game is good. Again, she is the second command to Jeremy. She's working alongside Jeremy, but like Jeremy, she's also not that well positioned at points in the game. Again, coming into the swap, again, Jeremy was a dead man walking had they gotten the tribal, which means that had challenges played out a certain way, I think Natalie would have been in a lot of danger. And that also means that coming into the merge without Jeremy there as a shield, I think she's also, again, potentially in a precarious position. Now, I will give her credit early on. I do think she was a major instigator of the Drew Christie move, which is something to give her credit for, and I think she builds really strong relationships. Again, the fact that she cultivates this really strong bond with Missy and Baylor, I think is very good. But I think an issue for me is I do think there's a part of her that is a bit too loyal, where, again, we do hear from After Fact that Natalie talks about how she was wanting to take Jeremy to the end if he didn't get blindsided, and how she never would have turned against him. And I do think adds to a bit of a luck factor here, and the fact that she kind of had to luck out in Jeremy being blindsided against her best interest for her to actually have this impressive run in the game. But again, she still does have this very impressive run in the game. Again, the Final 9 on is a very impressive stretch. Again, keeping around John Mish as shield for her, only to then snipe him out at the perfect opportunity and seize up the win at the end. Again, it's a very impressive game, but again, it's just a game that I think peaks a bit too late to be much higher on this list, where really every winner from this point forward, outside the next person we'll be talking about, really held that control the entire game. Or while, again, Natalie's stretch from the Final 9 on is probably more impressive than certain winners we're going to be talking about, it's still a much shorter stretch of the season. So where, again, I think she just kind of perfectly fits in this semi-dominant tier, which is the main reason I do have her here at number 19. Now, number 18, and here we're moving on to the final winner in the semi-dominant tier. Again, another person that I had in my dominant tier last time, and someone that was actually relatively high in it. And I mean, this is a pretty decent drop-off, not really for anything major. Again, it's purely me just restructuring the list that led to this person being lower. But at number 18, I do have Sarah Lacina from Survivor Game Changers. And again, this might be one that people will question. I mean, Sarah Lacina is someone that, again, played a very impressive post-merge game. Again, she is in the middle the entire game, being a major instigator of a lot of the early merge portion of the game, while then becoming essentially a dominant player towards the end stretch of the game. And mixing out of the fact that she was also relatively safe early on, was never really in danger throughout the early portion of the game. Again, it's a very solid, stable game with some qualms. Particularly, again, the final 6, Advantage Geddon, is a situation where she would have been voted out had Advantage Geddon not happened. Now, technically, she does have the legacy advantage in a position where she does a lot of good work and blindsiding Sierra to get that legacy advantage. And also, she didn't have that legacy advantage. She probably plays that round differently, you would assume. But again, it's still a situation where she had the majority of votes on her. She was primed to be taken out in a 3-2-1 vote in that situation, which is, again, definitely a negative. Even beyond that, again, I don't think she has that much outward control in the game until post-merge, where, again, she is someone that is playing very well from the middle. Again, she is someone that is very well liked, isn't really being targeted, but isn't really this big power player either. Again, she is doing some good work in building these relationships, but isn't really doing much with it come into the merge. And again, even in the early portion of the merge, and she is part of the Ozzy blindside, but she's not really a main instigator of that, and actually was extremely close to Ozzy and ends up actually burning his jury vote through voting him out there. But again, from that point on, she does start to become a big instigator in the game. Again, she flips to take out Debbie, also, again, burning her jury vote, but again, still better positioning herself in the game. She then takes out Zeke, again, another one, again, loyal ally to her, though also someone that was probably going to eventually turn on her, to where, again, more marginal of a move there, and also gave her a big advocate in the jury for her, to where we then see her press to play at the final 9, where she tricks Sierra into giving her the legacy advantage. We have her flipping at the final 8 to take out Andrea, making Cirie do a move that was against her best interest, which I think is impressive, along with the fact that we have the final 7 situation where she snipes Michaela out of the game, which is an impressive play to pull off there, though at the same time, I do think part of that is kind of lucky circumstances of the non-transferable line being put there in her vote steal. And also I do question, like, should she just gone for Cirie, as we literally see Cirie lead the charge against her in the following round, in a spot where I think Michaela probably would have remained loyal to her. And obviously we get the sloppiness of advantage again, but once it happens, she essentially has a clear road to a win, where again, she has the easy path. She has the final 3 of Brad and Troisian, where she easily wins, even against the likes of Ty and Aubrey. I think she is a very probable winner, though it's not necessarily guaranteed. But again, she's essentially back in the middle, being in a swing position, to really she could play those final few rounds however she wants. And obviously she gets to this pretty optimal final 3 situation where she just handily beats Brad Culpepper, despite there being some people that are bitter towards her. But again, I think as a whole, it's a very good game. I think it's a game where she's pretty safe throughout the majority of it. Again, outside of Evangegeddon, she is pretty safe in the game, has a lot of control at major portions of the game. Yeah, I think the thing for me that keeps her out of the dominant tier is, I mean, again, one, Evangegeddon, but also she's never really in a actual dominant alliance for a lot of the game, which is actually the interesting thing about Sarah's game. Again, she plays a game where she really flip-flops constantly throughout the game. Or again, usually with these dominant winners, they are people in dominant alliances, and alliances that really stick true and hold the numbers for major portions of the game. Sarah didn't really have that. Sarah is someone that kind of acted on her own, to where while she did have allies all over the board, she really just flip-flops left and right throughout the game, and that does lead to some questionable play at points, but again, it ends up being effective for her, to where, while again, she does have a lot of control in the back portion of the game, it does also have some questionable play with also a bit less security, and not having this solid base in the game, with her also, again, not really having that much control in the early portions of the game, with her not really seeming to be leading the votes of that portion of the game, where, again, just in comparison to the winners that we're about to be talking about, all these winners from this point forward were dominant winners that were in majority alliances the entirety of the game, outside of, again, maybe some blemishes here and there. So I think it's the fact that Sarah, again, doesn't really have that solid backing around her, and even then has some questionable play at points. Again, it is what ends up leaving her in this semi-dominant tier, landing her at number 18. Now number 17, and with this we are now officially starting the top tier of the list. The winners that I do consider dominant winners of the game, winners that had control throughout a large portion of the game. However, we're starting it off with this first sub-tier here of flawed dominant players. Players that do still have these big gaps in their games, despite the fact that they had control throughout a major portion of the game. Whether that be them lucked out by a twist, or having to win specific challenges, or just other really blatant lucky situations for them. So again, it kind of detracts from their games more so than the people that are above this tier. Where again, this is another kind of sizable sub-tier here. And we're going to be starting off at number 17. The lowest ranked of these dominant winners in my mind is Yul Kwon from Survivor Cook Islands. And this is a tough one to rank because I do think Yul is a very skilled player. I think the way he plays on this season is very impressive, especially considering the circumstances he was given. And through that, he plays a pretty dominant game. Again, he is in a good position throughout the entire pre-merge phase of the game. Again, no matter what tribe division he's in a very strong position. And once we get to the merge, he obviously pulls off that very impressive move of using his idol to pull Penner over and take control of the game. Again, all that is so impressive. The issue comes from a number of lucky circumstances surrounding his game. First, in the fact that obviously he has the God Idol, which really I don't think is a major detractor for him until the tail end of the game, where I think something to really note here is how it was eligible to be used at the Final Four in a situation where this season had a Final 3. But with that, that's also another lucky circumstance for him, in the fact that this is the first ever season with a Final 3. In a position where I do think he has greatly benefited from the fact that there is a Final 3. Because I do think if there was a Final 2 and Ozzy won Final Immunity, again, it's not looking great for Yul there. Though, again, I would not put it past him to pull over some sort of Tony Wu situation. But still, again, like, he is in this position where he is greatly benefited by these twists here. So while, again, I think he uses his idol very effectively in pulling over Penner, never having to actually use it, the general format of how that idol is utilized, and again, the fact that he was able to use it to scare off people from going format 4, again, I think is something that is pretty luck dependent. Even though, again, I think also there's some good play from at 5, where despite the fact that they knew that they could flush his idol at 5, they simply just didn't do it for whatever reason, which again, I think is a pro for him and showing him being able to maintain the loyalty of the likes of Ozzy and Sundra. But the other thing that I think is a major detractor from Yul's game for me is the bottle twist. Not just the fact that it was sprung up at the last second and it allowed for 2 people to go home right before the merge from the other tribe, that allowed them to come into the merge just down by 1 instead of by more than that. Though I think another major factor here is the fact that it was utilized here seemingly because production was scared of the white people really running the game, which obviously would have been terrible optics. Where while I do agree with production's decision to put in a twist like this to try to avoid that outcome, I do still feel like it's something we have to detract from Yule's game. The fact that a situation like this occurred made production put in a twist that allowed him to have more of a chance at winning the game through making numbers more even coming to the merge. Where again, had that not happened, had the merge happen at 10 like it normally would on most given seasons, he's in a much rougher spot. Though to be fair, I mean, his idol again would help him in this situation where again that goes back to how overpowered the specific version of the idol is. But again, like I think Yule's game here, again, it is a pretty impressive game. Again, he is able to run the show from beginning to end, pulls off a very impressive move in pulling over Penner, and again I think does a very good job at cultivating this alliance around him and have them never turn on him. But I still feel like the fact that he gets lucked out by a lot of circumstances on this season, along with the fact he barely wins a jury vote against Ozzy, and technically wouldn't have won a jury vote against Ozzy if he did not make a deal Adam that Adam stuck through, where Adam actually wanted to vote for Ozzy but voted for Yule because of their deal. Where again, it is just a lot. It's a lot of things here that just kind of culminate in Yule just having to be at the bottom of this sub tier, to where while again I think he plays a pretty impressive game on paper, and I think on paper he should be higher on the list, I just feel like it's all these things that knock him back down to number 17 here. Now number 16, moving on to another pretty luck dependent winner. Another one that again played an extremely dominant game, but one that was definitely benefited by things outside their control. And at number 16, we do have Parvati Shallow from Survivor Micronesia, which, I mean, technically, I believe Parvati is actually higher on this list than what she was last time. And a lot of that comes from the fact that, again, I think in comparison to Yule, I think Yule had a lot more things outside of its control really benefiting him in the game. Well, Parvati, again, still has a decent chunk of those things, but outside that plays a still very impressive game. Now, obviously, the main thing she's going to be remembered for is the Black Widow Brigade. Again, she creates this alliance that really runs the show. And again, I do think she's the main person to credit with the formation of this alliance. She is the person that actually got this group together, the one that built the bonds with Alexis and Natalie to bring them in with her already made group beforehand of her, Cirie, and Amanda. She's also the person that was the ultimate swing vote during the Ozzy vote, which allows them to take control of the game. While I do think Cirie was the main strategist for the group, I think Parvati definitely deserves a lot of credit for how she got this group together and had them stay true to each other for most of the game. Now, I will say, I do think Parvati does get, again, lucky at certain other aspects. Again, she gets lucky the fact that Johnny Fairplay quits in the first round. Now, I will say this is less of a knock for me than what it used to be, where I used to always look at it as she was definitely going home had it been for Fairplay not quitting. Though I think nowadays, where Cirie has said that she was going to stick by Parvati no matter what during that first vote, it does lead to her at least getting a tie, to where, again, I doubt Eliza would have gone to Rock. So realistically, I don't think Parvati would have gone home there. To be fair, even if she does go home there, I think part of it is due to pregame. Anyway, to where, again, it wouldn't be a massive knock against her. But also, obviously, the big thing to mention is the fact that we got a surprise final 2, where, again, it's kind of the opposite of the Yule situation, where Yule is very much benefited by a surprise final 3. I think Parvati here is very benefited by a surprise final 2, where, again, her intention was to go to the final 3 with Amanda and Cirie in a situation where she probably loses. Now, it's not guaranteed, but I do think it's very likely she loses in a 3-2-2 vote. Though, again, votes were just all over the place, to where, again, it's not this, like, end-all be-all of this massive knock against her game, but it is still a knock that she tried to go to the end game with a situation that she's not particularly favored to win in. Where I do think she had better odds going to the end against Natalie, who is not particularly well respected by the jury. And while Natalie definitely could have gotten some of the votes from the fans, I still think on paper it is the better option for her to go to the end with Natalie than Alexis Cirie, who's also just in general a better speaker, going to do better at Final Tribal. And I do think her entire notion of wanting to go to the end with Cirie is kind of misguided. And also beyond that, I also think Parvati doesn't treat certain jurors particularly well on this season, where I do find it funny how a lot of people talk about Parvati's biggest asset in the game is her social game, and she is this masterful social player, when, like, to me, that's never really been the case. I feel like Parvati is a bit overrated when it comes to her social game. While she is very good with these people that she does have these very intense bonds with, again, she was very close to most of the Black Widow Brigade, and she was very close to all of the Black Widow Brigade. She had a bond with, like, Ozzy and James, but she also treats other people pretty poorly. Again, she treats Eliza terribly on this season, to where I think she's very fortunate in the fact that Eliza still ends up voting for her at the end, despite the fact that she really didn't want to. You also have her treating Jason particularly poorly on his way out, though, to be fair, Jason was supposedly a dick also, but beyond that, I don't think she particularly handles Ozzy or James well on their way out. So again, I don't think Parvati's social game on this season is the greatest in the world, even though, again, she is very good at building strong bonds with the people she's with. But again, it kind of leads to her being kind of the leader of a clique that isolates the people outside of that clique. And through that, I think that's kind of what demerits her overall win equity, which essentially makes it so that I don't think Parvati can win on this season with more than 5 votes. I don't think there's a single situation from the merge on where she gets more than 5 votes, specifically because of how she burns certain members of the jury. And just as a whole, I think Parvati's Micronesia game is, again, solid. It's a dominant game. Again, she's the leader of Black Widow Brigade, one of the most impressive alliances in the history of the show. And she is the main person to get that group together. She is still involved in the overall machinations of that group, even though, again, I would give Sri a little bit more credit for that. But again, I do think it's the fact that she has a little bit of a rough start and also has a very rough end. Also has questionable jury prospects. But that's enough for me to knock Parvati down enough to be here at number 16. Now, number 15, now we're moving on to 2 winners in a row here that played really dominant games until the tail end of the game where they did need to win out, which, again, when we're comparing it against the top of the top winners at this point, that is a decent knock against them. The fact that they need to win the final few challenges, that they didn't position themselves well enough to get to the end through more social strategy means. Yeah, these are still 2 very impressive games. We're starting off with a winner that I've always been conflicted on this person's game. I mean, there's a point where I thought this is one of the best winners. There's a point where I thought this is one of the worst dominant winners. Yeah, here we are, again, slightly better than that, I guess. And here we have Tom Westman from Survivor Palau. And again, Tom's game is very impressive. Again, he is the leader of Ogakor, and through that is able to run that side of the game with them never going to tribal and maintaining his spot at the top of that pecking order, to where obviously every Koror member outside of Billard ends up making it to the quote-unquote merge, with Stephanie being added there. And really the next few votes after that are relatively easy, though we do see Tom making a big move at 6 with him and Ian really strong-arming Katie to take out Greg, which I think is a pretty impressive move from Tom's point of view. However, from that point on, he essentially needs to win out. I mean, he's in this position where if he doesn't win any of the next few challenges, I think he's very likely the boot in that spot, where Ian does openly start to campaign against him and start to work against him, to where, while again, maybe Ian, being the person that he is, ends up backtracking from that, feeling guilt for going against Tom, I do still feel like Tom was in a lot of danger during that endgame stretch. Again, that is something that definitely knocks him a bit here, even though really the rest of his game is extremely dominant. Now, I will say, I do think there is something that has lowered my opinion Tom's game over time, which is this notion that really no one actually wanted to take Tom to the end. Outside of maybe Karen would have, but really, again, we see Ian and Katie work against him. We see Greg and Jen work against him, and we hear talk from the cast about how no one actually expected him to make it to the end. They were all thinking that he was just going to be booted sometime around the mid-merge phase of the game. They obviously just never had the opportunity to take him out. And again, that is something that definitely does detract from Tom's game for me. The fact that his game is one where, yeah, I mean, he is in a dominant position. No one ever directly makes the move against him, but that's simply because they never had the opportunity to, because he just won every challenge and was very rarely ever vulnerable. And at the points where he was vulnerable, there was still Stephanie there as a shield for him. It wasn't even necessarily intentional. So again, I think that is my big complaint with Tom. I just feel like Tom plays a game that, while again, it is a dominant game in the sense that he is very much out in front and has a lot of control over how the game is playing out, it's also a position where that is the case because of his comp wins. Both in the fact that, again, Koror wins all those challenges that allows all of his people to make it deep into the game, but also the fact that he then wins individual immunities constantly towards the end that also ends up leading to others not being able to take him out. To where, again, it does lead to this big dilemma for me with Tom's game, and the fact that I do think there is a lot of impressiveness here with Tom from how out in front he is and how much control he was able to have, but the fact that a lot of that was just due to comp wins is what really attracts it for me. Where, again, for the winners that I personally prefer, I want them to navigate through the game through more social strategy means. And Tom just simply never really gave anyone the opportunity to even consider taking him out, considering he just constantly won competitions. So again, it's a bit tough for me to rank. I do feel like Tom's game, though, is still very dominant, but also still very reliant on competition wins, which is why he's here at number 15. Now, number 14, and we're moving on to another winner that did need to win those last couple challenges, but outside that also plays a pretty dominant game, and a game that in my mind is just more impressive all around. And that person is JT from Survivor Tocantins. And again, JT's game on this season is very strong. I mean, the fact that he essentially had people wanting to give up their games to allow him to get to the end and win is very impressive. Again, he gets to the merge and really bonds with the likes of Coach and Debbie, to where they really end up upending their own power structure to try to get the likes of JT and Steven further into the game, which all that is, again, extremely impressive. However, I think there there are some issues with JT's game. Not just in the fact that he needed to win challenges, but also the people who he takes towards the end of the game, where I think this is, to me, the biggest issue with JT's game, and something that I don't think many people really talk about, is the fact that, yes, JT plays a dominant game alongside Steven and ends up really taking control of the game after a merge, where after the Brendan vote, they're able to flip the vote onto Tyson and maintain the numbers from that point on by picking up Aaron, and all that is very impressive. The issue is that JT does this at the expense of the people that are willing to take him to the end of the game. And he takes out Brendan, he takes out Coach, he takes out Debbie, eventually takes out Taj before Final 3. All these people that are willing to take him to the end of the game, all while he goes to the Final 3 with Steven and Aaron, literally two of the only people that did not want him at the end of the game, which again is a pretty insane thing for JT to do here, where while obviously in that position, he's in the spot where if he wins Final Immunity, he's guaranteed to win. He's also in a spot where if he loses that immunity, he's more than likely gone. And obviously he didn't know that, as he put a lot of faith into Steven. And again, who knows if Steven would have felt bad and went back on the plan if he actually did win Final Immunity. But again, I do think JT kind of has some faulty navigation through the game, where again, I think the fact that he goes to the end of these people that aren't willing to take him to the end is kind of goes against the point of even being a dominant winner to begin with. Where while yes, he is very involved in decisions being made and is working alongside Steven to control the game, he's not really controlling the game to his best interest. Which is why, as time goes on, I become much higher on Steven's game. I think Steven is someone that is playing to his best interest for a lot of the game and are making the moves necessary to get him into an end game position for him to be guaranteed a spot at the end, while JT simply doesn't. Now, despite that, again, I do think JT's game, again, is still impressive outside that. Again, never really in danger until that tail end of the game, but he still, again, puts himself in a spot where he needs to win Final 3 immunity. He also, again, potentially could have gone home at Final 4. Again, a bit less likely, but again, I just feel like he doesn't set up his game properly. While again, it is a dominant game of him and Steven really upending the power structure that was there at the time of the merge and going from being these underdogs into these power players. Again, it's an impressive game, especially considering just how much win equity he had, where he probably beats everybody on the cast. I still feel like the fact that he has some faulty navigation through the game that leads them having to win that Final Immunity Challenge, again, is enough to detract from him for me to put him here at number 14. Now, number 13, we're moving on to another person on this list that actually did go up since the last time I made this video. This is someone that I had in the previous tier before this, in my last ranking. Now they're in the top tier. They're relatively high here, and that person is Tina Wesson from the Australian Outback. And Tina's game, again, is a pretty dominant game. Now, I will say I do think dominant games in Old School Survivor are not particularly hard to do, considering how less fluid the game is, and this is a season in particular that is probably one of the least fluid seasons in history of the show. But, I mean, by time of the merge, she essentially had the game won, which is something you can't say for really almost any other winner. Again, I think Tina here plays a really dominant game on paper, and when restructuring this list and creating all these tiers, again, it would be a disservice to not put Tina in this dominant tier of the game. However, I do feel like her win here is one where there are still a decent amount of holes through it. Now, I will say, I think she does some good work in the pre-merge. I think that's probably her best active work in the game is in the pre-merge, where she's able to convince Colby to flip against Jerry and Amber and take out Mitchell, which, again, is a really strong move there. Probably the best move in Survivor up to that point, as again, it allows her to have the majority on the original Ogakor and then come into the merge where she now has majority Ogakor. Once Ogakor gets the majority, she essentially has pretty much won the game just due to how the game is laid out. Now, again, I think this is purely a ramification of this being such an early season, where if that were not the case, I do feel like her treatment of Jerry was particularly poor to the point where I think Jerry would flip on her. However, again, this was a point in Survivor where that just wasn't a thing, that people would flip against their majority alliance and proceed to vote them out. To where even when we had Kelly, I mean, that was still a situation where Kelly never votes for one of her own alliance members until she has to. So again, I think if this was modern Survivor, I think Tina would be set up for a fall. Yeah, again, it obviously isn't. And that is something to factor in here, is the fact that considering the timing of when she played, I think she plays a pretty great game. Again, it's a game where she really utilizes the meta of season 1 and them not wanting a villain to win the game to her benefit. Again, she comes off as this good person and wants the good people to win, when in reality she obviously means her. Now, I do question how intentional that necessarily is, because I do think in reality Tina thinks of herself as a good person, and I don't think that was a gameplay thing, but it's still a thing that did benefit her in the game. And she's able to kind of live up to that reputation as the season goes along, again, flipping the vote on Jerry and Amber before the likes of Roger and Elizabeth, because she looked at them as good people. Now, again, through that, she's also essentially saying that Jerry and Amber aren't good people, which is, again, not good jury management. And she does specifically lose Amber's jury vote partially due to this, and again, should have probably lost Jerry's as well. Which just in general, this concept of her dragging Elizabeth and Roger later into the game because she thinks that they're good people is also just terrible play in itself. It's again just her increasing the chances of her losing the game, where again, had Amber or Jerry gone to the end with her, she handily beats them in any jury vote combination, while Elizabeth and Roger were much more difficult for her to beat. Probably people she does end up losing to, particularly due to how she treats Amber and Jerry, to where I just feel like all this is just completely unnecessary and inoptimal play that really just sums up my opinions on Tina's game. And the fact that, again, while I do think, yes, her utilizing the strategy of promoting we need a good person to win is good on paper, I do feel like she genuinely believes it and harms her game because of this philosophy. Which again is the reason why she is so low, despite having such a dominant game, is because I do feel like, one, I do question how much of her ability to really have this massive stranglehold in the game is due to actual gameplay, where again, this just felt like a situation where she just simply came into the merge with the numbers and never felt any adversity because of how stagnant this season was, because of how early of a season it was. And beyond that, again, she barely wins at the end. Again, she goes to the end of Colby, which again, having Colby take her to the end, impressive, even though, again, she was going to take Colby too. But still, she gets to a final three where both people are going to take her. That is impressive. In a situation where she beats both of them, though at the same time, again, she barely beats Colby. Really loses against Colby simply because Colby had a terrible final tribal performance in a spot where Tina didn't have a great one either. So again, at the end of the day, again, Tina's game is extremely dominant on paper. I think it is a game where she cultivates a majority alliance by the end of the pre-merge and essentially is able to run that to the very end. Now, again, I don't think this is a adaptable game. I don't think this is a game that is able to be repeated on really any other season of the show. But again, for what it is in this specific season, it is a very effective game. I just struggle putting it higher because, again, I don't think it is a game that is that repeatable, but also making some pretty unoptimal moves throughout a lot of the game. And again, getting to a final two where she barely squeaks out the win. But considering how just outright dominant it was, I do feel like I have to put her here at number 13. Now number 12, and at number 12, still continuing on in this tier, on to the last person on this list that I've never talked about before in a previous winner ranking. The last new era winner on the list at number 12, I do have Dee from Survivor 45, who is a very impressive winner. And this is a spot where I'm actually disappointed that Dee is this low on the list. I really wanted to put Dee higher. I remember when this season was airing, I was so impressed with how Dee navigated through the game, to where while again, I definitely have some strategic hiccups at points, I did feel like Dee was on track to play this extremely dominant game, would have been in the conversation of top 7, top 8 winners of all time. But then the final 5 happens, which is just such a train wreck, which simply just knocks her out of that tier for me. Again, it is what leads her into this flawed dominance tier. The fact that she gets so lucky at the final 5 that she does not go home there, to where literally the votes were primed for her to go home, and both Jake and Katurah were ready to vote her out, and the only reason she doesn't go home there is because of Katurah not really trusting Jake enough, and again, Austin having a conversation with her at the last second to take out Julie, which again was something that Dee didn't even want to do. And again, that also leads to the issue of her not voting for Julie, and the fact that she's too loyal to Julie and unwilling to vote for Julie, which would have saved her had Katurah actually voted for her, yet she doesn't because she's not willing to vote for Julie. And again, all that is just so bad. It's so bad. And again, she was so primed to go home in that spot. But again, outside that, her game is very impressive. Again, she is in a very strong spot in the original Reba tribe. She's in the majority alliance from the very beginning, has a really strong bond with Julie and with Austin, very well insulated, gets to the swap, very good position, though to be fair, she got a very fortunate swap. And even then, again, I think she makes some questionable play. Again, her still voting for Sifu after Sean wants to quit is questionable, and does lead to Sifu being suspicious of her, where while it was on the show, supposedly Sifu did consider splitting the vote on her during the J Maya boot round, where had that happened, Dee would have gone home because of the split vote, though again, to be fair, even that would have been a very fluky situation. But still, beyond that, again, she is really running the game alongside the Reba 4. She takes out Caleb immediately following that. She leads the charge in taking out Kendra. And then we get to her more impressive moves of her just completely snowing Austin at the final 7, where she gets Julie to play the idol and ends up somehow getting away with people not recognizing that it was her that told Julie, to where it allows her to blindside Drew the following round. So again, those are the most impressive aspects of her game. But again, I just think at the tail end of her game is just so rocky. It's like, it's so disappointing to see. Or again, I remember I was just so disappointed to see how rocky the end of her game was, where really up to that point, again, she is an extremely impressive winner. She would have been at worst number 8 on this list. And then just considering just how extremely lucky she was to survive the final 5 round, and mixing that the fact that again, she also almost loses to Austin, to where she ends up losing votes at Final Tribal. Again, Kendra ends up flipping at the last second. She also burns Bruce for no reason. That was also poor play. Where, again, I just feel like there's just a bit too much at this point to really have her as someone in those top 2 sub-tiers, but still a very impressive winner, still a very impressive win, just one that, again, had a lot of lucky circumstances at the end, which leaves her here number 12. Now at number 11, we're moving on to another winner that has actually gone down on this list over time. I mean, this is a winner that I remember I was extremely high on at the time they won, and was even decently high on them at the time I did my last ranking, yet here they have dropped to the top of this sub-tier here, when again, beforehand they were in the next sub-tier, and that winner is Jeremy Collins from Survivor Cambodia. And again, Jeremy is a winner that I think plays a very impressive game. I think this is a game when just looking at the level of difficulty of this game, I think Jeremy plays, again, a very impressive game. Again, it is a game where this is a very high level of gameplay. There just being these constant shifting alliances, and Jeremy's able to navigate through all of them despite being someone that was perceived as this massive target. Where again, he was able to really learn from his previous season and utilize the concept of meat shields, and through that really lower his threat level, and again, a very impressive way. The issue comes from the fact that, again, because of how hectic this end game is, I still feel like he is out of the loop at points in the game. Again, he is failing to save Steven to where he needs to utilize the idol on him, only to then lose Steven the very following round. Again, all of that being based around him not really having that much control in those portions of the game. He also doesn't want to take out Joe when they do. So again, there are decent amount of portions of this game where he is not really getting his way. And mixing out the fact that, again, he questionably needs his idol at Final 6. Again, it was a tie vote, but it's also a situation where he just has a complete misread on that round, thinking that Kimmy was with him the entire time, when in reality she was obviously against him. And again, I just feel like there's a lot of questionable play through all this. Now, there's also some very impressive play. Again, the fact that he was able to essentially be the swing vote at Final 5 is pretty insane, considering how big of an endgame threat he was. And again, played a very solid, consistent game early on where he was never really in danger, and did, again, have a lot of agency in the game. He built really strong relationships, and again, was involved in taking Monica out of the game, and built relationships with Steven and Spencer. Comes in their merge with so many connections. Also ends up utilizing both idols efficiently, to where, again, while you can definitely qualm the fact that, again, he saves Steven just for him to be taken out the following round, again, he's still able to keep Steven around as a shield for him, which I still think is a good play. And just in general, again, Jeremy's game is very good still. It is still a very impressive game, and he is a massive jury threat at the end, where I think he beats pretty much everybody but Wentworth, and even then that's a very close vote. And again, just the level of difficulty on this season, where again, just everyone's playing super hyper aggressively on Cambodia, for him to be able to navigate through that game with how big of an inherent target he is, again, I think is very impressive. I just feel like there's way too many points where he simply was just kind of on the outs, or didn't really get his way, to where it does kind of detract from his overall winning game for me. To where, because that, again, I struggle with putting him in the top 2 tiers, and because that he's at the top of this 3rd tier at number 11. Now number 10, and at number 10, we are starting off the 2nd sub-tier of this list, which I'll be honest, I don't have that great of a name for, but it's essentially just standard dominant wins. Again, people that ran the game for a massive chunk of it, though, again, still have these like minor qualms with them that keep them out of having this like complete dominance over the game, to where, again, these are still very impressive winners, though, again, with each of these people, I will have something to detract from them. Anyway, starting it off at number 10 is someone that I used to have lower on the list. I mean, this is someone that has climbed on the list since the last ranking. And again, I think this is a person that plays one of the most dominant games in the history of the show on paper, yet I think there are some questions to be had with that person's game. And at number 10, we do have Brian Heidik from Survivor Thailand. And again, Brian Heidik is a weird player to assess for me, in the fact that, again, on paper, he plays the most dominant game in Survivor history. Again, he runs the show pretty much the entire season, and is in the majority alliance the entire time, has really strong one-on-one bonds, gets to the merge, up in numbers, and is never really in danger from that point forward. Again, it is one of the most dominant games ever played. However, I think there's a couple factors leading up to that. Again, there's one, the fact that, again, there was a late merge on this season, which really allowed Chuigon to gain even more of a majority, to where there was simply no chance for Sukjai to catch up by that point. Also, I think it's, again, obviously a very early on season, and through that, the overall level of gameplay was less dynamic, to where in the modern day, I do feel like a player like Helen would fully recognize the fact that she has the flip against Brian. Obviously, I never end up making the most of that opportunity. And obviously, like a big detractor I've always had against Brian is the fact that he barely wins the game in a 4-3 vote against Clay, of all people. I think that is pretty bad, especially when the overall tactics he uses in the game are tactics I don't particularly like. Again, really utilizing racism and misogyny to try to bond with people, which is just very icky. And again, I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility. I think it's where if Ted had found that out, I could have flipped his vote, though even then it's not really that secure. But again, still, the fact that he only wins 4-3 against Clay in a spot where they're essentially voting for him because of his work ethic around camp, more so than anything he does socially or strategically in the game, is kind of funny considering how dominant of a game he ends up playing. But again, it is an extremely dominant game. He runs the show from the very beginning. He has an alliance with Clay and Ted right away and is able to build a bond with Helen that gives them the numbers and comes to emerge with the numbers, where he just runs the show from that point forward, where really, again, at the end of the day, like, I did very much consider putting him around where Tina is, where Tina is pretty much around where I had him last time. Again, it is towards the bottom of this dominant tier, and again, I think there is still an argument for that. However, I think for me, the reason why I have him above Tina is because I do think Brian was more intentional in his game than someone like Tina. I think, while again, Tina does play a dominant game and wins the game at the very end, I still feel like it's a situation where she didn't have the jury votes as locked up as someone like Brian did, and even beyond that, I feel like she also mismanages certain members of the jury, to where I feel like Brian, again, as much as I'll criticize his tactics that he utilizes, was again at least a very intentional player. I do think he was someone that was building all these one-on-one bonds and creating this power structure around him very intentionally. So again, he essentially had the game won by the time of the merge. So while I think he gets a bit luckier at the time of the merge than someone like Tina does, and just how the game was essentially already over just due to the number distribution, I also feel, again, he had those jury votes locked up against Clay. So again, the only thing that could have potentially stopped it is Ted finding out tactics Brian used, and even then, I don't think that would have actually been enough, to where I do think Brian had the game completely unlocked by the time of the merge, which again is something that you just don't see, which is why, again, it makes it tough to rank Brian, as and it's on paper one of the most dominant wins we've ever seen. Yeah, I feel like even within that, there is some very rocky other situations, particularly his jury votes, and him playing a game that's not very repeatable outside of this season. But I feel like, just again, due to the sheer dominance of this game, it feeling like an extra level above Tina's, for me, it does land him here at number 10. At number 9, again, someone that played an extremely dominant game, though also has a few rocky aspects of their game, and that person is Tyson Apostle from Blood vs. Water, who again plays an extremely dominant game. So again, he is in the majority alliance the entire time, and by the time of the swap, he really ends up taking control of the game. Again, he builds relationships with Sierra and with Hayden and Caleb in order to organize this group against Aris that blindsides Aris at the time of the merge, and from that point on really just maintains control the rest of the way. Again, picks up Sierra as a number that's able to win the day over newbies by the time of the mid-merge, and again gets to the end in his ideal situation where he wins. Now, there are question marks with his game for sure. Again, the fact that I do question other winning scenarios for him. I do think he struggles to win against Sierra and Hayden. I think in a situation against Tina, which again was very close to happening, I do debate how that would have gone. I do still lean Tyson, but again, it's a very, very close vote. So again, that's not great. The fact that he plays as dominant of a game as he does and still struggles with win equity in that way, again, is not ideal. However, the bigger knock against him for me, and the one that really actually puts him at this point in the list instead of a bit higher, is the Rockstraw situation. I think the fact that he has to go to Rocks the final 6 is a massive negative. As I mentioned before, I think if you have to go to Rocks, you essentially made a mistake in the game. That means you were not able to cultivate enough numbers to maintain a majority, and especially when we were coming from Tyson's position where he had the numbers coming into the round, ends up losing the numbers along the way. I think that's an issue. Now again, beyond that, his game is very, very strong. He has a lot of impressive play, every other aspect of the game, and essentially once the rock draw happens, he's essentially already won the game, outside of a freak last second immunity win, to where, again, it is still a very, very impressive game. Them doing a lot of impressive lead work to put himself in this dominant position. But again, he still almost loses control by the end. And again, his win prospects were not the greatest, to where, again, I do feel like he can't be in the top tier, but for me, it is still enough to put him here at number 9. Now, at number 8, we're moving on to another dominant winner of the game, played a very impressive game, had pretty much control of the game from beginning to end, though the massive calm for me is win equity, but still a very impressive game all in all, and that person is Todd Herzog from Survivor China. And again, I think Todd plays a very impressive game. Again, Todd is pretty much in control of the entire game, with him never really being in danger, despite there being people that do want to target him. He again is part of the initial majority alliance on the Fei Long tribe. He puts together this massive plan to save James after the swap, which, I mean, had it been necessary, it would have allowed them to maintain numbers coming to merge, though again, they end up maintaining numbers coming to merge anyway. But again, he obviously has numbers coming to merge, so where again, he's at the top of that power structure. He is was very close to the likes of Courtney and Amanda, and despite most people knowing that they're close, he's still able to get people to not go after him. Still having a really good bond with James and John Robert, and obviously able to blindside both of them. Now, I do think his endgame stretch is a little bit rockier, where again, by that point, people are targeting him. Amanda does consider taking him out, though ends up not actually going through with it. But again, I think part of that is due to her kind of underestimating his win equity and how respected he would be. And a lot of that comes from the fact that I do think there is definitely some questionable win equity from Todd on this season. Again, he barely wins the game here in a 4-2-1 vote in a situation where he flips John Robert at the last second, which again is good play, but still, again, like he is in a position where he barely ends up squeaking out this jury vote in a spot where, again, there's been numerous conflicting claims, though, again, I do expect Amanda to have been the front runner coming into that final tribal, even though, again, we know that someone like PG was someone that was rooting for Todd at that point, and though we do know that the likes of like PG and Jamie were very impressed by Todd's game, to where, again, I think it would have been a very questionable jury's decision, and again, that is a lot of the reason why he's as low on the list as he is. Again, I think his winning prospects are, again, a little bit questionable, along the fact that, again, I don't think he had this like massive stranglehold on the game as a certain other winner that we'll later be talking about that also had questionable win equity. So again, just as a whole, I do find his game to be just kind of conflicting here. Again, it has a lot of dominant aspects to it. Again, he for sure belongs in this tier here. Yet I do think the fact that the jury didn't necessarily see it, and again, I don't know how the jury votes in many other situations where I don't know if he pulls out the win. Again, it does leave this question mark on his game, but it is still a very impressive game, a very dominant game, and that's why he's here number 8. Now number 7, here we're moving on to a winner that was actually higher on my previous list. I actually genuinely cannot believe I had this person as high as I did on my last list. I do think this person played a very good game, obviously. They are this high on the list, but again, the fact that I had him even higher is pretty mind-blowing to me. But at number 7, again, a very impressive winner still. The first of this person's 2 games, we do have Tony Velachos' game from Survivor Cagayan. And again, last time I had him at number 4, which I think is kind of insane I had him that high, even though, again, I think Tony obviously plays a very impressive game. It's an extremely dominant game in the power position for most of the game. Does a lot of legwork throughout the game to really maintain that position. However, again, I think there are qualms to be had. I mean, first in the fact that he is actually not in that good of a spot in the original Braun tribe. He has to do a lot of legwork there to pull in Sarah and, again, potentially take Cliff out of the game, though obviously that doesn't really come to be. But again, he is able to take Cliff out of the swap, which, again, was a question mark definitely at the time, especially, though I think considering the fact that he was able to build this loyalty with LJ and Jeffra that did maintain through the merge, I think it makes that move, again, a decent one there. Especially as he's able to re-pick up Woo, and again, comes to the merge down in numbers, but again, also has impressive play there. So while I do think Trish deserves more of the credit for pulling Cass over to their side, I do think Tony still plays that round pretty well, and him being able to read that Sarah was not on their side and recognize they need to adjust their plan, though at the same time, again, obviously he misplays an idol, and again, that's not particularly good. But really, once that move happens, he really just runs the show from that point forward. Again, he has pretty much full control over the game from that point forward. Again, he's in charge in getting rid of Morgan to lessen the beauty tribe numbers. He can keep in these bigger threats in the game with him really utilizing this meat shield strategy before it became popular. He then proceeds to blindside LJ, which at the time was a very questionable move. And again, I think he still plays a bit too aggressively in his position, but again, it still ends up working out to his favor and him being able to get back within the majority group immediately following this, while also securing his relationship with Woo, where again, he votes out Jeremiah following that, only to flip again to take out Jeffra. Again, really being able to keep around these big shields for him in the game, which really allows him to get all the way to final 3 pretty much unscathed, keeping Tasha and Spencer in the game to be taken out for him down the road. Now he also ends up leading the charge against Trish, which again wasn't really on the show, but again, it's a questionable move. I mean, obviously it's getting rid of someone that is extremely loyal to him, though at the same time it's also putting a jury vote on the jury, though I do think at the end of the day, I actually do find the move kind of questionable in the sense that I do think he kind of misread Trish's win equity at the end, with him thinking that Trish was someone that would have won at the end. Yeah, again, from what we know post-show, it seems like she had no chance at winning at the end. But again, obviously the most impressive move of it all is the fact that he's able to convince Woo to take him to final 2, which is just pure insanity. To where Woo is so aware at a point that taking Tony to the end means he loses, yet Tony is able to trick him into taking him under the guise of him having to play this honest and loyal game, and that's what the jury will respect, which, again, is pretty insane there. And just all in all, again, Tony plays a very impressive game, a very dominant game, him having so many moves on his resume, yet it's still a game where, again, I think he makes some questionable decisions at points. I think he does have some misreads here and there that, again, make it tough to put him much, much higher on the list, but it's still a very impressive game, a very dynamic game, and because of that, for me, he's here at number 7. Now number 6, and here we're moving on to a winner that I think is probably one of the most underrated winners in history of the show. I mean, while there obviously are supporters of this player. I mean, there's also a lot of people that think he's bad and don't assess him too highly, which again, I've constantly talked about how good of a player I think this person is, even though I don't think they're particularly interesting TV. But again, I think just purely as a player, purely as a win here, I think it's a very impressive win. And that game comes from Tommy Sheehan from Survivor IOI. Now, I think Tommy's game on this season is maybe not as good as my assessment of him as a player. I think Tommy is, again, probably the best one-time player at this point in Survivor history. I think he demonstrates so many skills for the game in his one appearance. Being able to play from the top, being able to play from the bottom, all very impressively. And again, we see that on this season. Again, in that one season, he's able to do what many people are not able to do in their entire Survivor career, in showing so many different ranges of his ability as a player, to where, again, I think Tommy plays, again, a very impressive game on IOI, despite the fact that he gets very unlucky in many circumstances. To where, again, he's initially in the majority alliance, alongside the group that votes out Molly, yet despite making that move, he's still able to maintain those relationships with the people on the outside of that vote. He then gets swapped into a position where, again, he should have been good, where, again, they were prepared to blindside Aaron, and even if they didn't, they had the backup plan of taking out Elaine. Again, he should have been pretty well set coming into that vote, until Elaine just out of the blue is handed a vote blocker, which leads to Tommy losing one of his closest allies in Jason, which through doing so, it leaves him as a potential target coming into the following round, where he's now down in numbers because of that. But even despite that, again, we see him do very good work in pulling over Aaron and Missy, to where we see them throw Dan Spilo under the bus, to where, again, debatable on who exactly would have gone home had they ever gone to tribal again. But again, they don't do so because they get to the merge, where at that point, Tommy just really runs the show from that point forward. Now, I think the big criticism people have with Tommy's game is the fact that there's a lot of talk about how Lauren really ran the game, and that Tommy was just her second in command, which is simply not true. It's actually the opposite. Well, yes, if Lauren gets to the end with Tommy, it is very likely that she wins. Again, Lauren was one of the biggest jury threats on the board. However, that does not mean that the way that the actual season played out was in a way that Lauren dictated. It's actually the opposite. Again, we see that Tommy was able to cultivate this alliance around him and set up this boot order that essentially had all of his people making it to the end over Lauren. Again, Lauren had very good relationships with the likes of Missy and Aaron and Elizabeth, and guess who goes out early on in the merge? It's Missy, Aaron, and Elizabeth. To where he's able to get into the end game, where, again, he already had a locked-in final three with Dan and Dean. That probably would have been the final three had Dan not been ejected from the game, in a spot where, again, he just probably wins in the exact same way. Outside that, again, he had the backup of Nora, someone that he was able to convince to go after Lauren, despite her actually being closer to Lauren for more of the season. He also had Janet, someone that he was able to get taken further into the game, despite Janet not having a particularly great relationship with Lauren. Where, again, Tommy gets into the end game in a position where he has all of his people there, while Lauren loses all of her people on the way. And mixing that, the fact that also Tommy, again, faces so much adversity throughout this portion of the game, yet is able to overcome that. Again, the fact that he is so unlucky in the split tribal twist, where he's put in this position where he should be a dead man walking. He is with 4 other Lyros. He should so clearly be the boot there, yet he somehow survives it. He is able to flip the vote onto Missy, which I think is very, very impressive there. At the final 8, again, we see talk about potentially going after Tommy. Yet we see his relationship with Dean cause Dean to rat out the plan to him and stops that from happening. Again, like, there are these points where Tommy faces this adversity and we see him overcoming it through really impressive social strategy, to where, while yes, obviously people will bring up, oh, he only beats Dean and Nora by the end, he would have lost against Lauren and against Janet. It's like, yes, that is true, but they should also have not been as close to getting there as they should have been. Where there's talk about, oh, if there was no idle nullifier at 5, then Janet would have been guaranteed at the end and Tommy would have lost, which is, yeah, that's true, but that's also because Dan got ejected from the game. That was even a possibility, where if that had not happened, Janet just gets blindsided with an idol pocket at 6, and even if she used the idol in that spot, she gets voted out in 5 unceremoniously. And the same thing goes with Lauren. Lauren wasn't even supposed to make it to final 4. Lauren was supposed to be taken out in 5 before Dan got ejected. And even then, again, she wasn't a particularly good fire maker, so it was easy to take her to 4 where you could snipe her out of the game. To where, again, just in general, I do feel like Tommy's game is very slept on. Again, a very impressive winning game. I will say the main reason why he's not higher on this list is because, again, like, he's not as out in front as the winners we're about to be talking about. Every winner that we talk about from this point on is someone that was pretty clearly a big jury threat and someone that was set up to win the game, yet was just simply not taken out. Despite that, again, Tommy is someone that had a lower threat level, and he is someone that was not as big of a threat, and where, again, he did hide behind the likes of a Lauren and a Janet for a lot of the game, and then was able to snipe them out at the end, which is, again, very impressive play. But again, I think for people that were more out in front, like the top 5 that we're going to be talking about, I feel like that is something that knocks him down a little bit. Also, again, we just don't know what would happen at that swap tribe, even though I think that was a very unlucky circumstance. Again, I think there's at least a chance that he would have gone home, to where that's a minor thing to knock as well, to where, again, I think there are these, like, very minor things that knock him out of this top tier. But overall, again, Tommy's game, though, is very impressive. One of the most underrated winning games in my mind, because that for me is here number 6. Now number 5, and at number 5, we actually have a last second change to this list. I mean, this is someone that I always expected to be much higher on this list. I actually ranked this person in my global winner ranking as being higher on the list than this. However, properly thinking it through and separating them as a player from the game they played on this specific season, along with the fact of separating like the level of difficulty of the game and purely factoring in their positioning in the game, their navigation through the game, how safe they were in the game. Again, I feel like I had to track them a little bit, but at number 5, still a very impressive game. That comes from Tony Velachos from Winners at War. And again, I think there's a serious debate that Tony's game here is one of the most impressive winning games in history of the show. Again, I think it is a game where obviously the level of difficulty he faces off against is extremely high. Again, he faces off against 19 other winners of the game. And not only that, but also faces off against Edge of Extinction in a spot where Edge of Extinction does nothing but harms him in the game. Where despite facing so much adversity in this season, specifically from the Edge of Extinction, he's still able to overcome that. Obviously, initially through the extortion advantage, which he's able to use his social strategy to circumvent, but also Natalie's return from the Edge, which is a position where he should have been screwed. Where at that point in the game, again, had the Edge not existed, he essentially already won the game. Again, the game is essentially over by that point, where he had the alliance with Sarah and Ben that was just going to run the show, and he handily beats them at the end. Again, he had the game won under most other circumstances, but this was a circumstance where the Edge does exist. And through that, we do have a very rocky endgame from him. One where, again, while he has the right read at the final 6, he's not able to convince anybody to go his way. And through that, he ends up having to use his idol there. He then is left out of the loop at the final 5 vote, though, again, intentionally so, because I guess Sarah wanted something that was her own individual move, but again, still left on the outs of final 5, and essentially at final 4 needs to win fire making, where he's in a particularly rocky spot at that point, where while he does win at the end, again, his endgame is very rough, but obviously it's very rough because of the Edge of Extinction, which again is this big dilemma for me. It's how much the Edge retracts for something that is out of his control, to where while these are major knocks against his game, again, if Edge of Extinction was not involved in making these things go through, he is significantly lower on this list. However, again, these things happen because of the Edge, which I think makes it excusable, but I kind of recognize that at the end of the day, it's not that dissimilar from how Tommy played the game and the adversity that Tommy faced, to where I think for me, it came down to, okay, well, I either move both Tony and Tommy up higher on the list, or I move Tony down. And I decided to move Tony down here because, again, I think that makes more sense, because really their games are not that dissimilar. Now, I think Tony has bigger individual moves on this season than Tommy, which is why he's above him. Again, I think their early games are pretty similar. Again, both in solid alliances, not really out in front at that point in the game, but I will say something about Tony, though, is I do think he gets paranoid coming in the tribal at points, to where it does kind of freak people out at points, but again, it's not enough to really turn the vote against him at any point. Even though, again, we do see him getting pretty fortunate at the Sandra boot, where that was a position where he comes extremely close to being IO'd out of the game, though obviously that was also a position where the reason why he's not IO'd out is because he cultivates a really strong bond with Denise, to where Denise didn't want him out, though I think you'd also say that the reputation of Sandra and the acclaim she would get for making that move also play a factor there. So again, I think that is something that's a bit wonky, but once we get to the merge, again, he's kind of under the radar early merge, still a major figure within the majority alliance, but not really that integral of a number until the Sophie move. Again, the Sophie move is still to this day one of the best moves in the history of the show. I think it's a very impressive move for him to pull off, and he does so expertly. And moving forward, he also blindsides Kim in a really impressive way, being able to get all of his alliance members on board, and really his alliance with Ben, Sarah, and Denise really ends up running the show until the point where the Edge returnee comes back, to where, and it's a very impressive game, especially against the caliber of players he was facing off against. I do feel like, though, again, when assessing their games, only how they played on this specific season, how they were positioned, and how they navigated through the game, I still have the dock for the end of the game, while also still having the dock for some minor hiccups early on in the game, especially when, like, he's not even really getting his way at points. Again, there's a point where he wants to blindside Tyson, only for that to not go through. He also wants to, at a point, take out Nick, and that doesn't go through. So again, like, he is not necessarily getting his way at all points in the game, where while again, I think he faces off against a lot of adversity, ends up overcoming that, and in general has a very impressive game. It's simply just one that has enough holes here, whether forced or unforced, that made me knock him down slightly to number 5 here. And now number 4, and with us reaching number 4 here, we have now reached the final sub-tier of the list, the top tier, which I do call complete dominance. These are players that really just ran the show from beginning to end, having very little difficulty in how they ran the game, and very minor issues with how they ran the game. Mind you, I still do have issues, particularly these first 3, but these were all still, again, very impressive games, the most impressive games in Survivor US history. So let's start off at number 4, where for me, 3 and 4 on this list here are really interchangeable. They're both on the same caliber. But for me, at number 4, I am going to go with John Cochran from Survivor Karamoan, which is a pretty big jump up for Cochran. I believe he was kind of in the middle of the previous tier last time I did this list. Now he's in the top sub tier. And again, I think Cochran's game for me really ages extremely well as time goes on. Now, a lot of criticism towards Cochran's game is the fact that he obviously came into the game with a lot of friends, and that really boosted his position in the game. And I agree. And that is definitely a thing that did help him in this game. But I think he also navigates through his game really expertly. To where, again, I don't think Cochran is the greatest player in the world. I think he is a player that is very inconsistent. I don't know if he can repeat this specific appearance. However, I think the way he plays this season is, again, insanely impressive. Again, he is able to run the show pretty much from beginning to end. While, again, he's not as out in front as the winners that we're about to be talking about, which is the main reason why he's actually as low as he is. Again, the reason why he is at number 4 here is because I do think he kind of is more in the background up until the Philip boot, where, again, Philip obviously takes the forefront, which, to be fair, he's using Philip as a shield, but still, Cochran is someone that, while he's involved in what is going on, again, he was the swing vote in taking out Francesca, he remained in the majority through the post-swap phase of the game. He's still, again, in a position where other players are in the limelight more than him, yet once Philip goes, I think is really where his game really skyrockets. I mean, at that point, he pretty much takes control of the majority alliance, working alongside them and taking out Malcolm and Reynolds, and then leads the charge against Andrea, and then proceeds to also lead the charge against Brenda, which I think is the best moment of his game. I think that is the most impressive move of his game, for him to convince Dawn to turn against Brenda, someone she had such a close personal connection with, essentially making a move that is so bad for Dawn's game, but so good for his. I think that is the point where, again, I think that's the most impressive aspect of his game, and really from that point on, again, he just has an easy road to the end, where while some people claim that, oh, if Eric didn't get medevac, then Cochran could have been in danger, I don't feel like he would have. I think Cochran is still pretty safe in the game, where, again, if Eric doesn't win immunity, Eric's more than likely gone, and even if Eric does win Final Four immunity, I don't even think it's a guarantee that he takes Cochran out at that point, where, again, I think Cochran just, again, plays a very impressive game, again, wins the game at the end in a unanimous vote. I think more than likely wins against pretty much anybody in the end game stretch, where outside of maybe Malcolm, I think he just demolishes everyone on this cast in a jury vote. Or mixing out the fact that his navigation through the game is extremely impressive with very few holes. But really the biggest hole for his game is, again, the fact that he's not out in front as his next 3 people we'll be talking about, along with the fact that he also had some pre-game benefits due to him being friends with the decent amount of the people on the favorites tribe. I mean, outside that, again, an extremely impressive game, which is why he's here number 4. Now, number 3, and at number 3, we're moving on to a winner that, again, I think is on the same level as Cochran. I think there are reasons why I think you would actually have him lower than Cochran. Again, for me, it's extremely close. Yeah, I do think this person overcame a lot more adversity in a spot where they were still never really in danger despite that adversity, while also was, again, in a leadership position for most of the game, and that person is Earl from Survivor Fiji. And again, Earl's game is insanely impressive, and considering he's someone that didn't watch the show and was a last-second addition to the cast, again, the fact that he was able to play as dominant of a game as he ends up playing is insanely impressive. Again, he plays a near flawless game. Again, from beginning to end, he is in power position the entire time. Again, despite coming from the have-not tribe, he's still able to be at the center of that tribe's power structure, and he never really loses at positioning along the way. He gets swapped into a position where, despite him being down in numbers on paper, he's still able to cultivate a new majority from that. Mind you, I think this leads us to probably the biggest, not necessarily knock, but thing to definitely mention here of Earl's game, which, again, is similar to Cochran being benefited from being on the favorites tribe, where he had a lot of his former friends. I think Earl was very benefited from how this game started in the overall casting structure of this season, where this is a season that started with every player on one beach, and through that allowed for him to build relationships with the other side, and through that there ended up being this builders versus explorers dynamic that essentially gave Earl more options coming into this portion of the game, where, again, he essentially is reunited with the people that he bonded with early on in the game. Also, beyond that, a major aspect of his game is the fact that this was a cast that was very diverse. Again, this was a cast utilizing a lot of people that they had recruited previously for Survivor Cook Islands, and through that there were way more POC on this season, to the point where, again, the black people created a all-black person alliance that greatly benefits Earl in this game, where it allows him to have these bonds with Cassandra and Dreams that really end up running the show moving forward. Again, that is the reason why they have this very solid deal to get to the end, is because they cultivated this alliance from the very beginning, which I do think is, again, impressive play from Earl to actually make that all effective, to where, while, again, I think these are things that definitely benefit Earl that are not necessarily there in every season, I feel like the way that Earl utilizes these are extremely impressive. Again, being in a dominant position throughout the entire game, despite, again, being in a spot where he shouldn't be. Again, he is on the have-not tribe and comes into the swap and the later merge down in numbers on paper, and even loses some of his closest allies along the way, with, Michelle Michelle getting sniped out of the game, yet despite that, he's still able to maintain control in the game. Again, lead the charge against the 4 horsemen. And obviously there is the final 6 round, which again is the other minor knock against him, though again, it's not that major of one, where he is technically blindsided by Yao Man getting the majority of the votes. Yao Man ends up using his idol effectively there. And also there's also the criticism that most people have, like, oh, he would have lost against Yao Man. They almost got to the end with him, which is not even true. Again, based on what we've heard from the jury, it does seem like Earl would have beaten Yao Man, where Yao Man himself says that Earl would have beaten him at the end. So again, just all in all, Earl's game, extremely impressive. Again, while I think there are some aspects of the season's format that greatly benefited him, and again, there's that one point where he is left on the outs, which even then, again, is still in a pretty good position following that, and again, wins handily in pretty much every jury situation. Again, maybe not against like some of the Horsemen members, but still, again, very, very impressive game. Dominant game from beginning to end, faced a lot of adversity and overcame it. And again, despite facing adversity, never actually harmed his actual positioning in the game. A very, very impressive game. He's here at number 3. Now number 2. And at number 2, we are keeping with my original list, though this was something that I very much debated quite a bit. But at number 2, I do have Boston Rob Mariano from Survivor Redemption Island. And again, I thought about this for very long. I did very much contemplate putting him lower. I mean, because like Rob plays a game here that, again, is very impressive. He has a complete stranglehold on the game in a way that is near unprecedented. Again, even in comparison to the number 1 winner on the board. Rob is someone that has this like complete stranglehold on every aspect of the game, to where he is never in danger throughout this entire season. He is also extremely dominant through the game, being a major decision maker in all the votes that are going through, being out in front the entire game. Like when you think of a dominant winning game of Survivor, I feel like Boston Rob is the person you think of. Again, this is nearly as dominant of a game as you can possibly have. However, along with that does come some minor issues, which again is the reason why I did consider putting Rob lower. One, in the fact that, like the last couple we would talk about, again, he does have some outside of the game situations that definitely benefit him in the season. Again, the fact that he just came from Heroes vs. Villains, where he's portrayed very positively, obviously allowed for people to not look at him as a threatening figure coming into the season, which is obviously something that benefited him. All the fact that obviously people claim that, oh, the Ometepe tribe was made for Boston Rob and that he can control them, which again, like, it definitely isn't the most strategically savvy tribe in the world. But I do also feel like the cast of Redemption Island is one where, again, Zapatera is actually a very strategically savvy tribe. Again, the likes of Steve and Mike and David Wright were all very strategic players. And I think if Rob had started on Zapatera, obviously the game could have been very different. Mind you, I think he also still probably makes merge, unlike Russell. But even on Ometepe, again, there is Francesca, there is Christina, these players that are adversarial towards him at the very beginning, and he's able to overcome that. So while obviously, yes, he is given a massive benefit on the season, being a 4-time player facing off against 1-time players. Again, obviously, yes, there is an inherent advantage through that. Yeah, I think when people claim like this entire season was rigged for Boston Rob, I don't think that's necessarily the case. And really the aspect that was rigged for him, debatably, was Redemption Island, which is something that he doesn't even utilize. It's something that it actually only hurts his game through bringing back these people that he had previously burned. And even then, he's able to make the most of that. Again, pulling off that Matt Elrod vote is very impressive. Single-handedly winning him the game in that spot, giving him control of the game, and in a spot where, again, he faces very little adversity. The only spot where he does face any level of adversity is at the final 5, but again, that's a spot where he has an idol. And even then, I don't think Natalie would have flipped against him anyway, to where, and again, I think the way that he's able to dominate this game is like a step above the way that the likes of Tina or Brian dominated this game, which again, that was the debate for me, is like, what is the difference between Boston Rob and someone like Brian, someone like Tina, who pretty much dominated the games from beginning to end, facing very loud adversity? I think the major difference for me, at least, is the fact that I think Boston Rob does a lot more actively to maintain that power structure. And we see him train the buddy system, getting everybody to not even communicate with the other tribe, pretty much giving him sole control through that. Also the fact that I feel like the level of gameplay on this cast was higher than that of Thailand and Australian Outback, which again might not be a popular opinion, but I do fully believe that to be the case. Also the fact that Rob does end up winning in a wide margin, to where, again, with both Tina and Brian, they barely win in their final 2 situations. Brian, again, barely wins against his best possible outcome, to where, again, with Boston Rob, again, he wins handily in the situation he's dealt with. Now, the big debate does come from the fact that how many situations can he win, where this is obviously a highly contested topic, where people say that Boston Rob can't win unless he's in the final 3 with Natalie and Philip. And while I do think that definitely is his best case scenario, and I think he definitely faces off against much tougher competition had Ashley been at the end with him, I do also still find it tough to believe that he would lose in a lot of situations, especially against other Ometepe, to where a lot of these claims that Boston Rob would have lost handily come from Ralph, a person that was outside of the main Zapatera power structure, and through that doesn't really bear any weight on what the likes of Mike and Steve and David were really thinking. Along with that, the other person that has said this is Andrea, someone who isn't part of Zapatera and was actually disliked by Zapatera. To where, again, while I definitely think there is a chance, obviously, that Boston Rob struggles to win any other situation, I don't personally really believe it. Because again, I find it so tough to believe that the likes of Mike Chisel, who post-show called Boston Rob the best player to ever play Survivor, or that Matt Elrod, who at the time even said that Boston Rob is the best player to ever play Survivor. And also, again, the likes of David and Steve, who are these very strategically minded players, I find it very tough to believe Boston Rob loses in a lot of these other scenarios. To where, well, again, it definitely is possible. I don't put as much faith into it as it seems like this universal consensus is that he would just guaranteed lose in a lot of these other situations. But even then, again, he plays extremely optimally to make that the case. While obviously there is luck involved in the final immunity challenge, where obviously if he loses that challenge, again, he still makes it to the end, but again, is against Ashley, who's tougher competition. He still, again, plays extremely optimally throughout this entire game to get to this precise endgame situation that he handily wins. So again, really, I feel like this is a dominant game to a level that we have never really seen. A spot where Boston Rob had this straightforward plan from the time to merge and systematically gets that optimal situation. So again, while there is definitely luck involved in that, I just feel like the precision that he plays in this game, the fact that he's able to get into this endgame situation where he wins in a blowout, is all just such impressive play. Or again, I did contemplate putting him lower, but I just feel like the complete dominance he has over the game is enough to put him here at number 2. Now, number 1. The best winning game in the history of Survivor US, for me, remains the same. It is the winning game from Kim Spradlin from Survivor One World. And again, it's not particularly close. I mean, again, when assessing the last few people we've talked about, I think all of them had extremely dominant games. Again, Boston Rob had such a clinical game, and him being able to run the show from beginning to end, getting everything that he wanted along the way, while Earl and Cochran were able to maintain control for a lot of the game and have massive win equity at the end. And I feel like Kim is like a perfect mix of the two. While she isn't as completely dominant in the game as someone like Rob, where again, Rob had his set game plan from the merge on and really executed on it, I feel like Kim is someone that doesn't really have that precision, but still plays an extremely impressive game. Again, keeps her options open the entire game. Comes into the merge already being set up to essentially go on to win the game. Having connections with the likes of Troy, Jay, and Michael from her swap tribe. Obviously having the connections with all the women, which she's able to get together to really run the show. And even within that is perfectly positioned within it. Again, has a final 3 with Alicia and Christina, but also a final 3 that she goes to the end with Sabrina and Chelsea. And again, she just really has so many options in the game. And again, she plays a game that just is extremely dominant in the sense that she just has so many options in the game, and all of them leading to her essentially going on the win. Where I think Kim Spradlin is someone that has massive win equity on this season. I think she beats literally everybody by the time of the merge. I think when looking at the numbers and who would have been on the jury, had the level of respect people had for her by the end of the game remained, again, she pretty much handily beats everybody. And she obviously wins in her all 3 situation, which is actually one of the tougher ones for her to win. Again, it's against Sabrina and Chelsea, 2 pretty competent jury threats. So again, I think that is maybe an issue for Kim, and the fact that she doesn't go to the end against the biggest goats on the board. Again, she actively goes to the end in a situation that's actually harder for her to win, but still demolishes them at the end. Or again, if she wanted an easy win, she could have gone to the end against Christina and Alicia and probably would have won unanimously in that spot. Yeah, again, she goes into the harder situation and still wins 7-2. And again, she just completely runs the show of this season. Again, she is the person to convince Troyzan to take out Michael and then lead the charge in blindsiding Jay, to where, while again, we do have her burning Troyzan's jury vote through him being pissed off at her, switching the votes at the last second at a spot where they're supposedly in lockdown. Again, to me, that doesn't really matter into anything. But again, she's able to blindside all these people in the game and still keep them on her side, where the votes that she has against her at the end, again, were Troyzan, who is upset at her for her breaking the rules, but also Leaf, who, again, she genuinely never really bonded with, which is probably the biggest qualm in her game, where again, is a near perfect game. Again, I think in comparison to Boston Rob, though, again, she's not as out in front as Boston Rob. Again, she's not this main figurehead for the game for the entirety of the game, where, again, while she is in a very strong position in the majority alliance right away on the initial women's tribe, she's not really in this like super dominant position that as her being this like sole decision maker like she is later in the game. But again, it is the fact that she's able to take that position after the Michael vote and really just, again, have so many options, all of which leading to her win. It's an extremely impressive game. Again, mixing the outright dominance that Boston Rob has, particularly in her endgame stretch, with the massive win equity that someone like Earl has, while also having just so many numerous paths that lead to a win. Again, it's just a near flawless game to where, again, she pretty much had the game won by the time she makes the Michael Jefferson vote, to where, to this day, still the most impressive winning game in the history of Survivor US, and that is why she is here at number 1. But there we go. I mean, that is my updated winner ranking for Survivor US after Survivor 46, 5 years after my initial list. This took way too long. Again, I did not anticipate on this video being exponentially longer than my original video. But again, I did want this to be this comprehensive outlook on my thoughts on these players' games, along with how my opinions of these people have changed over time. So again, that's another updated ranking off the board, and maybe I'll be around 5 years from now and redo it again then. We'll see. But beyond that, again, I will still continue to redo some of the other rankings I still have coming up. Again, I still do intend on remaking my Survivor season ranking as well, so stay tuned for that. Probably coming out within the next month. Again, probably coming out relatively soon. Again, definitely before Survivor 47. Well, obviously, I'll be covering that later in the year, and obviously just outside that, expect the same style of videos. But for now, that is the video. My updated ranking for Survivor US. Thank you for watching.